The gavel crashes down like a death sentence, and Judge Royland Keene doesn't even look at the evidence before him. He's too busy sizing up the black man in shackles standing at the defense table. The courtroom reeks of stale coffee and older prejudice. "State your name for the record," Keene drawls, his voice dripping with the kind of authority that's never been questioned. "Darius Cole," comes the response, calm, measured, almost gentle. Keene's lip curls. "Watch your tone in my courtroom, son. You're already in enough trouble." The bailiff smirks. The prosecutor adjusts his cufflinks. And in that moment, everyone in Veterans Court understands that the verdict was written long before the defendant ever walked through the door. Before we dive into what happens next, I want to invite you to stay with me until the very end of this story, because what unfolds in that courtroom will shake everything you think you know about justice. Please like this video and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The morning started the way most mornings did in Royland Keene's Veterans Court, with absolute certainty about who held the power and who would be leaving in handcuffs. Keene had presided over this specialized docket for 11 years, building a reputation as a no-nonsense judge who didn't coddle veterans struggling with addiction, homelessness, or PTSD. His supporters called him tough but fair. His critics, the few brave enough to speak openly, called him something else entirely. The courtroom itself reflected Keene's personality, austere, unyielding, designed to intimidate rather than comfort. Oak-paneled walls absorbed sound and hope in equal measure. The state seal hung behind the bench like a shield, and beneath it sat Keene himself, mid-50s, silver-haired, with the kind of perpetual tan that spoke of country club weekends and fundraiser galas. His black robe was immaculate, pressed to razor sharpness, as if the fabric itself had been trained to maintain discipline. To his right sat the court stenographer, Marisol Vega, a woman in her early 40s whose fingers moved across the keys with mechanical precision. She'd worked in this courthouse for 16 years, recording words that sealed fates, destroyed lives, and occasionally, though rarely, offered redemption. Marisol had learned long ago to keep her face neutral, her thoughts private, and her observations locked behind professional courtesy. The transcripts didn't lie, but they also didn't editorialize. They simply recorded what was said, not what was meant. District Attorney Gavin Rourke occupied the prosecution table with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case he actually cared about. 38 years old, Georgetown law, 2 failed runs for state legislature, and ambitions that stretched far beyond this courtroom. Rourke treated Veterans Court like a performance stage, a place to demonstrate his commitment to law and order while building a highlight reel for future campaign ads. He wore charcoal suits that cost more than most defendants earned in a month, and his closing arguments always seemed calibrated for maximum soundbite potential. The gallery was sparsely populated that Tuesday morning. A handful of social workers shuffled paperwork. 2 uniformed bailiffs stood at attention near the exits. A reporter from the local weekly dozed in the back row, pen resting on an empty notepad. And scattered among the wooden benches sat a cluster of veterans, men and women whose military service had earned them a specialized court designed to address their unique challenges, but whose presence here suggested the system had failed them long before they'd ever stood before Judge Keene. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff's voice cut through the ambient murmur. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Royland Keene presiding." Everyone stood. Everyone except the man in shackles at the defense table. Darius Cole remained seated not out of disrespect but out of physical limitation. The chains binding his wrists to his waist and his ankles to the floor made standing a dangerous proposition. He was 41 years old, 6 feet tall, with the kind of lean, disciplined build that spoke of morning runs and careful nutrition. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, standard issue from the county detention center where he'd spent the previous 72 hours without bail, without counsel, and without a single phone call to anyone outside these walls. But it was his face that caught Marisol's attention as her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Darius Cole didn't look angry. He didn't look scared. He looked observant. His dark eyes moved slowly across the courtroom, cataloging details with the kind of methodical attention that suggested training far beyond what most defendants possessed. When his gaze briefly met hers, Marisol felt an odd flutter of recognition. Not because she knew him, but because she recognized something in his expression that she'd seen before in attorneys, investigators, people who understood courtrooms from the other side of the bench. Keene settled into his chair with the satisfied sigh of a man about to enjoy his morning ritual. He opened the case file before him, a thin folder that should have been much thicker given the charges it contained, and glanced down at the defendant without really seeing him. Case number 2024 VC 11847, the bailiff announced. The People versus Darius Cole. Charges include disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, assault on a peace officer, and inciting a public disturbance. Rourke rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket in a gesture that seemed designed to draw attention to his tailored silhouette. Your Honor, the people are ready to proceed. Keene's eyes finally settled on Darius with the kind of casual disdain usually reserved for particularly unpleasant paperwork. Mr. Cole, stand and state your name for the record. Darius remained seated, his voice calm and clear despite the awkward angle of his restraints. Your Honor, I'm unable to stand safely in these chains. My name is Darius Cole. A muscle twitched in Keene's jaw. When I tell you to stand in my courtroom, you stand. Bailiff, assist the defendant. Two bailiffs moved forward, gripping Darius under each arm and hauling him upright with more force than necessary. The chains rattled. Darius maintained his balance with visible effort, his expression never changing from that same careful neutrality. Now, Keene continued, his voice taking on an edge that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. Let's talk about why you're here, Mr. Cole. According to the arrest report, you disrupted a Memorial Day ceremony at Veterans Memorial Park, became verbally aggressive with event organizers, and physically resisted when police attempted to escort you from the premises. Does that sound accurate? No, Your Honor, Darius replied evenly. That's not what happened. Rourke's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Your Honor, if I may, the defendant has a documented history of anti-patriotic behavior and inflammatory rhetoric targeting veterans organizations. The incident at Memorial Park was simply the culmination of a pattern. Objection! Darius's voice cut through Rourke's performance without rising in volume. I haven't been provided with counsel, haven't been allowed to enter a plea, and these characterizations are both false and prejudicial. The courtroom went very still. Defendants in Veterans Court rarely interrupted the prosecutor. They certainly didn't use legal terminology with the precision of someone who'd studied case law. Keene's face darkened. Mr. Cole, you will speak when spoken to and not before. Mr. Rourke has the floor. With respect, Your Honor, I have a constitutional right to counsel and due process. I've been denied both for 72 hours. You're in Veterans Court, Keene snapped. This is an intervention program, not a criminal trial. Your rights are exactly what I say they are in this courtroom. Marisol's fingers slowed on the keys. She'd transcribed thousands of hearings, but something about this exchange made her stomach twist. Keene's statement was legally questionable at best, and the defendant had just identified the problem with surgical precision. Yet no one else in the courtroom seemed troubled by what they were hearing. Rourke seized the moment, his voice rising with practiced indignation. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of behavior that led to Mr. Cole's arrest. He refuses to acknowledge authority, refuses to show respect for the institutions that veterans like himself should hold sacred. I'm not refusing respect, Darius interrupted again, his tone still maddeningly calm. I'm asking for basic constitutional protections that apply to every defendant regardless of venue. One more interruption and I'll add contempt of court to your charges, Keene warned, leaning forward with both hands flat on the bench. Do you understand me? Darius met the judge's glare without flinching. I understand that you're threatening me with additional charges for asserting my rights, Your Honor. I'm simply asking that this court follow established law. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marsal watched Keene's knuckles whiten against the dark wood of the bench, watched the vein pulse in his temple, watched the careful mask of judicial authority slip just enough to reveal something uglier beneath. Bailiff, Keene said quietly, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, add 1 count of contempt of court. Mr. Cole, since you seem to have difficulty understanding how things work in my courtroom, let me make this crystal clear. You are here because you chose to disrupt a solemn ceremony honoring fallen heroes. You chose to create a scene that required police intervention. and now you're choosing to compound those mistakes by showing disrespect to this court. Your Honor, Darius began. I'm not finished. Keen's voice cracked like a whip. You claim to be a veteran, Mr. Cole. You wore the uniform. You took an oath. And yet here you stand, in chains, because you couldn't control yourself at a Memorial Day event designed to honor the very brothers and sisters you supposedly served alongside. What does that say about your character? What does that say about your fitness to walk free in civilized society? Marisol's fingers had stopped moving entirely now. She stared at her screen, at the words accumulating there, and felt a deep unease settling in her chest. This wasn't a hearing. This was a public humiliation designed to break the defendant's spirit before any facts had been established. Darius took a slow breath, his jaw tight. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality that Marisol couldn't quite identify, something that sounded almost like pity mixed with steel resolve. Your Honor, with all due respect, you don't know anything about what happened at that ceremony. You haven't reviewed evidence, haven't heard witness testimony, haven't examined the circumstances that led to my arrest. You're making assumptions based on a police report from 3 decorated officers, Rourke interjected smoothly, rising again to his feet. Officers who have no reason to lie, no history of misconduct, and who all corroborate the same sequence of events. Your Honor, the defendant's attempts to muddy the waters with legal technicalities are simply another example of his refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. I'm not muddying anything, Darius replied, his voice hardening slightly. I'm asking for a fair hearing. I'm asking for counsel. I'm asking for the opportunity to present my version of events before being sentenced for crimes I didn't commit. Keen slammed his gavel down with enough force to make several people in the gallery jump. Your version? Your version doesn't matter, Mr. Cole. What matters is that you disrupted a sacred event, endangered public safety, and assaulted officers of the law. Those are facts. Everything else is noise. Those aren't facts, Darius said quietly. Those are allegations. And in any legitimate court, allegations require proof. The silence that followed felt dangerous. Marisol could see Keen's chest rising and falling with controlled breathing, could see Rourke's satisfied smile, could see the way the bailiffs had shifted their weight as if preparing for something ugly. Mr. Cole, Keen said finally, his voice dropping to something that would have sounded reasonable to anyone who wasn't paying attention to his eyes. Let me tell you how this works. You can cooperate with this court, show remorse, accept the rehabilitation program we're offering, and maybe, walk out of here with a future. Or you can continue with this antagonistic approach, force me to treat you like the criminal you're behaving like, and spend the next several years behind bars wondering where you went wrong. I went wrong, Darius replied softly, the moment I assumed this courtroom operated under the rule of law. The gavel came down again, harder this time. Contempt of court. Second count. Bailiff, make a note. Mr. Rourke, let's hear the state's recommendation. Rourke stood with the bearing of a prosecutor who'd already won and was simply enjoying the victory lap. He held a leather portfolio that he opened with deliberate slowness, extracting a single sheet of paper as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Your Honor, the state has grave concerns about Mr. Cole's fitness for community supervision. His behavior today demonstrates a fundamental lack of respect for authority, a pattern consistent with the antisocial tendencies documented in our pre-trial assessment. The Memorial Day incident wasn't an isolated outburst. It was part of a broader pattern of antagonism toward veterans organizations, law enforcement, and civic institutions. Marisol frowned. Pre-trial assessment? She'd transcribed hundreds of these hearings and had never seen a pre-trial assessment completed within 72 hours of arrest, especially not for a misdemeanor case that should have resulted in a citation and release. Darius's voice cut through her thoughts. Your Honor, I'd like to see this pre-trial assessment Mr. Rourke is referencing. I was never interviewed, never evaluated, never— You don't get to demand evidence, Mr. Cole, Keen snapped. This isn't a trial. This is a hearing to determine whether you're suitable for Veterans Court intervention or whether you need to be remanded for formal prosecution. Then I request formal prosecution, Darius said immediately, with a jury, proper discovery, and actual legal representation. Rourke's smile widened. Your Honor, the The defendant's attempt to avoid accountability through procedural manipulation is exactly why the state recommends immediate remand to county jail pending formal charges. We're prepared to upgrade the charges to felony assault given the severity of injuries sustained by Officer Matthews during the arrest. This was news to everyone in the courtroom, including apparently the bailiffs, who exchanged confused glances. Marisol's fingers flew across the keys, capturing every word while her mind raced. Officer Matthews hadn't been mentioned in any previous documentation. The arrest report listed 3 officers, Daniels, Wu, and Kowalski, with no mention of injuries beyond minor bruising. "Your Honor," Darius said, his calm finally showing the first cracks of frustration, "there was no Officer Matthews at my arrest. There were no injuries. This is fabrication designed to justify. Are you calling a sworn law enforcement officer a liar?" Keen's voice rose to fill the courtroom. "Are you suggesting that District Attorney Rourke is fabricating evidence in my courtroom?" "I'm saying the facts don't support the narrative being presented," Darius replied, his hands clenching into fists despite the chains. "I'm saying I have a right to challenge these allegations with evidence and witnesses of my own. I'm saying, you're saying a lot of things that sound like a man who thinks he's smarter than everyone else in this room," Keen interrupted. "Let me disabuse you of that notion right now, Mr. Cole. I've been on this bench for over a decade. I've seen hundreds of veterans come through these doors, good men and women who made mistakes and had the humility to accept help. And then I've seen men like you, men who think the rules don't apply to them, men who hide behind legal jargon and false righteousness while spitting on everything the uniform represents." Marisol's stomach turned. This had crossed far beyond judicial discretion into something that felt personal, vindictive, designed to destroy rather than adjudicate. Darius stood very still in his chains, his expression settling back into that unreadable neutrality that had first caught Marisol's attention. When he spoke again, his voice was soft but carried clearly through the silent courtroom. "Your Honor, I'm going to ask you one more time to provide me with legal counsel and a fair hearing, not because I expect you to grant it, but because I want it on the record that I requested it and was denied." Keen leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin with an expression of theatrical patience. "On the record. Of course. Let it be noted that the defendant requested counsel and that this court, in its discretion, has determined that veterans' court proceedings do not require appointed counsel at this preliminary stage. Mr. Cole will have access to a public defender if and when formal charges are filed." "When formal charges are filed?" Darius's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your Honor, I've already been charged. I'm standing here in shackles facing multiple criminal allegations. The Sixth Amendment doesn't contain an exception for preliminary stages or specialized courts." "The Sixth Amendment," Keen replied with a thin smile, "guarantees counsel for criminal prosecutions. This is an intervention hearing, Mr. Cole. Semantics matter in law, as I'm sure you're aware." Rourke chose that moment to deliver what he clearly considered his coup de grace. "Your Honor, if I might add one additional piece of context that speaks to the defendant's character and the threat he poses to public safety." Keen gestured magnanimously. "Please proceed, Mr. Rourke." The Memorial Day ceremony that Mr. Cole disrupted wasn't just any community event. It was specifically organized to honor Gold Star families, mothers and fathers who lost their children in service to this nation. These families paid for premium seating, donated to the organizing committee, and came together to grieve and remember in a space that should have been sacred. And Mr. Cole, Rourke paused for effect, turning to face the defendant with an expression of profound disgust, decided that was the perfect moment to launch into a political tirade about inequality and access. He confronted grieving mothers, Your Honor. He accused them of buying their way into patriotism while others were shut out. The gallery erupted in whispers. One of the social workers shook her head in visible disbelief. The reporter in the back row suddenly sat up, pen moving across the notepad with renewed interest. Darius's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "That's not what happened. That's not even close to what happened." "Oh?" Rourke's tone dripped with mock curiosity. "Then please, enlighten us. What exactly did happen at that Memorial Day ceremony?" Marisol leaned forward slightly, her fingers poised above the keys. Despite everything she'd witnessed over 16 years in this courthouse, despite her practiced professional distance, she desperately wanted to hear Darius's answer. because something in Rourke's performance felt too polished, too perfect, too carefully constructed to be the whole truth. Darius met Rourke's gaze directly. I attended the Memorial Day ceremony because I'm a veteran. I served 8 years in the Army, 2 deployments, honorable discharge. I went to honor friends I lost, including my best friend Marcus, who died in Kandahar. When I arrived at Veterans Memorial Park, I found that the ceremony had been reorganized from previous years. The front rows, traditionally reserved for Gold Star families and disabled veterans, had been cordoned off as premium seating with a $300 ticket price. Meanwhile, elderly veterans in wheelchairs were being directed to the back, behind a rope line, where they couldn't see or hear the ceremony. "That's," Rourke began, but Darius kept speaking, his voice gaining strength. "I saw Marcus's mother, Mrs. Chen, a 74-year-old woman who lost her only son, being told she needed to pay $300 or stand in the back. I saw Master Sergeant Williams, a Vietnam veteran with 2 Purple Hearts, being physically blocked from accessing the front rows by event security. So I asked the organizing committee, politely, calmly, why the format had changed, why families who'd given everything were being priced out of honoring their dead. And when they couldn't answer to your satisfaction, Keene interjected icily, 'You made a scene.' I asked questions," Darius corrected. "I documented the seating arrangement. I helped Mrs. Chen find a seat where she could actually participate in the ceremony honoring her son. And yes, I raised my voice when security tried to physically remove elderly veterans from a public park during a memorial service." "You see, Your Honor?" Rourke spread his hands as if Darius had just confessed to murder. Even in his own version of events, Mr. Cole admits to being disruptive, confrontational, and physically interfering with event security. The fact that he's wrapped this behavior in self-righteous language about helping veterans doesn't change the fundamental reality. He broke the law. "I helped elderly Americans access a public ceremony in a public park," Darius replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "If that's illegal in your version of America, then we have a serious problem." Keene's gavel came down hard enough to crack. "We have a serious problem, Mr. Cole, but it's not the one you think. The problem is you, your attitude, your belief that you can decide which laws apply and which don't. Your conviction that you're somehow entitled to disrupt civic events because you disagree with how they're organized. With respect, Your Honor, the First Amendment—" "Don't lecture me about the Constitution!" Keene's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the oak paneling. "I know the Constitution, Mr. Cole. I took an oath to uphold it, which is more than you seem to be doing right now. The First Amendment doesn't protect assault. It doesn't protect resisting arrest. And it certainly doesn't protect the kind of self-righteous grandstanding you're engaging in." Marisol's fingers had gone numb from typing, but she couldn't stop. Every word was building a record that felt increasingly important, increasingly dangerous, increasingly wrong. Darius took a long breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. The frustration was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like resignation, mixed with grim determination. "Your Honor, I'd like to make a formal request for a phone call. I've been in custody for 72 hours without being allowed to contact family, friends, or legal counsel. That's a violation of—" "Denied," Keene said flatly. "You're not entitled to phone privileges until after this hearing concludes and you've been formally processed." "I've already been formally processed. I was booked, fingerprinted, photographed, and held without bail. I'm asking for one phone call, which is a basic right even for—" "I said denied, Mr. Cole. Are you having difficulty understanding simple English?" The courtroom held its collective breath. Something in Darius's expression shifted, just the slightest change, barely perceptible, but Marisol caught it. It was the look of someone making a decision, crossing a threshold, committing to a path that couldn't be uncrossed. "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," Darius said quietly. "I understand that this court has denied me counsel, denied me due process, denied me basic constitutional protections, and is now denying me even the minimal rights afforded to arrested individuals. I understand that you've already decided my guilt regardless of evidence, and I understand that nothing I say here today will change that." "Finally," Keene said with a humorless smile, "you're starting to grasp reality. Mr. Rourke, the state's recommendation?" Rourke didn't even consult his notes. Given the defendant's complete lack of remorse, his confrontational attitude, and the severity of the underlying offenses, The state recommends remand to county jail without bail pending formal charges. We'll be filing upgraded charges to include felony assault, felony obstruction, and enhanced penalties under the statutes protecting veterans' memorials and public ceremonies. Felony assault, Darius repeated softly. For asking questions at a Memorial Day ceremony. For assaulting a police officer during your arrest, Rourke corrected sharply. For resisting lawful commands. For creating a public safety hazard that required multiple officers to subdue you. The fact that you continue to minimize these actions tells this court everything it needs to know about your character. Keene nodded slowly, clearly savoring the moment. I'm inclined to agree with the state's assessment, Mr. Cole. You've demonstrated through your behavior today that you pose a risk to public safety and lack the basic respect for authority necessary for community supervision. However, he paused, letting the word hang in the air. I'm willing to offer you one final opportunity to salvage this situation. Darius said nothing, his expression carefully neutral. If you're willing to accept responsibility for your actions, Keene continued, his voice taking on a tone of false generosity, if you're willing to express genuine remorse and commit to the Veterans Court Rehabilitation Program, I'm prepared to reduce the charges and release you under supervised conditions. You'll attend counseling, perform community service, submit to random drug testing, and check in regularly with a court officer. Complete the program successfully, and these charges disappear from your record. Refuse, and I'll accept Mr. Rourke's recommendation in full. It was a trap wrapped in the language of mercy. Marisol had seen this play out dozens of times in Keene's courtroom. Accept guilt for crimes you didn't commit, surrender your rights to challenge the charges, and submit to months or years of invasive supervision, or risk going to trial against a prosecutor who'd stack charges until the potential sentence became unbearable. Most defendants took the deal. Most defendants couldn't afford to fight. Darius Cole looked at Judge Keene with an expression that suggested he understood exactly what was being offered and what it would cost. The silence stretched out, taut as a wire, until finally he spoke. No, Your Honor. I won't accept responsibility for crimes I didn't commit. I won't plead guilty to lies. And I won't participate in a system that demands I surrender my rights in exchange for basic justice. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Rourke's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. Apparently even he hadn't expected such categorical refusal. Keene's face flushed a deep red that suggested either rage or stroke potential, possibly both. You're making a grave mistake, Mr. Cole, Keene said, his voice deadly quiet. A mistake that will cost you years of your life. Maybe, Darius acknowledged, but at least I'll still have my integrity. The gavel came down with finality. Rahman denied bail, formal charges to be filed within 48 hours. Bailiff returned the defendant to county detention. And Mr. Cole? Keene leaned forward one last time, his voice dropping to something meant only for Darius but carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. When you're sitting in that cell for the next several years, I want you to remember that you chose this. You chose pride over pragmatism. You chose ego over freedom. And you'll have plenty of time to reflect on whether that was worth it. Darius met the judge's gaze one final time. I chose the Constitution over corruption, Your Honor. I chose truth over convenience. And yes, I'll remember making that choice every single day, no matter how long I'm in that cell. The bailiffs moved forward to escort him out, but before they could reach him, Darius turned slightly to face Marisol directly. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and he spoke clearly enough that she had no choice but to record it. Ma'am, I want to ensure the record reflects that I was denied counsel, denied due process, denied a phone call, and denied a fair hearing. I want it noted that I requested these basic rights multiple times and was refused, and I want it noted that I maintain my complete innocence of all charges. Marisol's fingers trembled slightly as she typed. Noted, she said quietly, her professional voice not quite concealing the emotion beneath it. Thank you, Darius said simply. Then he turned and allowed the bailiffs to escort him toward the door, his chains rattling with each careful step. As the courtroom door swung shut behind him, Marisol stared at her screen, at the words she'd transcribed, at the record she'd helped create. 16 years she'd been doing this job, 16 years of maintaining professional distance, of telling herself that her role was to document, not to judge, not to intervene. But something about this case felt different. Something about Darius Cole's calm certainty, about the precision of his legal objections, about the way he'd maintained his dignity even while being publicly humiliated. It all suggested that this wasn't just another defendant being railroaded through a broken system. Marisol glanced at Judge Keene, who was already calling the next case as if the previous 20 minutes had been nothing more than a minor administrative matter. She looked at Rourke, who was texting on his phone with a satisfied smile. She looked at the empty defense table where Darius had stood in chains, asking only for the rights that every American was supposedly guaranteed. And then, during the brief recess before the next hearing, Marisol did something she'd never done in 16 years of court reporting. She opened a new browser window. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for just a moment before she typed, Darius Cole Attorney. The search results loaded. Marisol scanned through them quickly. A few social media profiles, a memorial page for someone who died 5 years ago, a real estate agent in Arizona. Nothing. She tried again. Darius Cole Prosecutor. Still nothing relevant. She tried Darius Cole Federal. The first result made her breath catch in her throat. U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Special Litigation Section, Staff Directory. She clicked the link, her heart hammering. The page loaded slowly, agonizingly, until finally a staff listing appeared. She scrolled down, scanning names, until Cole, Darius J., Senior Trial Attorney, Special Assignment, Judicial Misconduct Investigations. Marisol stared at the screen. Read the entry 3 times. Checked the photo. Same face, same calm expression, same eyes that had met hers across the courtroom moments ago. Her hand moved to her phone before she could fully process what she was doing. She pulled up the main DOJ switchboard, took a breath, and dialed. Department of Justice, how may I direct your call? Marisol's voice came out steadier than she felt. Civil Rights Division, please. Special Litigation Section. One moment. The hold music was generic, bureaucratic, eternal. Marisol glanced around the courtroom. Keene was still off the bench. Rourke was still on his phone. No one was paying attention to her. Special Litigation, this is Agent Reeves. Yes, hello, Marisol said, keeping her voice low. I'm calling from... I need to verify the status of one of your attorneys. Darius Cole. I have him listed as Senior Trial Attorney, but I need to confirm... I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't provide information about our staff to outside callers. If you need to speak with Mr. Cole, I can transfer you to his direct line, but he's currently in my courtroom, Marisol interrupted, her professional composure cracking slightly. In chains, being denied counsel and held without bail on charges that the voice on the other end of the line changed completely. The bureaucratic pleasantness vanished, replaced by ice-cold authority. Ma'am, I need you to identify yourself immediately. Where are you calling from? What courthouse? What charges? Marisol provided the information in a rush, her words tumbling over each other. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Ma'am, Agent Reeves said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made Marisol's skin prickle. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not alert anyone in that courthouse about this call. Do not inform the judge or the prosecutor or anyone else that you've verified Mr. Cole's employment. Do you understand? I understand, but federal marshals will be at your location within the hour. Until they arrive, proceed normally. Record everything that happens. And Ms. Vega... He paused, and she could hear papers rustling in the background. Thank you for making this call. You may have just prevented a significant miscarriage of justice. The line went dead. Marisol sat very still at her stenographer's station, staring at her blank screen, trying to process what she'd just learned. Darius Cole wasn't just a defendant with an unusual knowledge of legal procedure. He was a federal prosecutor. Specifically, a federal prosecutor who investigated judicial misconduct, who had just been arrested, denied counsel, denied due process, and publicly humiliated by a judge with a documented history of questionable rulings and a prosecutor with political ambitions. In a courtroom where every word was being recorded for the official record, by Marisol herself. The bailiff's voice cut through her thoughts. All rise. Court is back in session. Marisol stood mechanically, her mind racing. An hour, Agent Reeves had said. 60 minutes until federal marshals arrived at a courthouse that had no idea what was coming. 60 minutes until Judge Royland Keene's carefully constructed kingdom began to crumble. 60 minutes until the man in chains revealed himself to be the one person in that courtroom who actually held the power. Marisol settled back into her chair, positioned her fingers over the keys, and prepared to document what promised to be the most important hearing of her 16-year career. She just hoped the official record would be enough to protect her when everything fell apart. Because it was going to fall apart. That much was certain. The only question was how badly, and who would be left standing when the dust cleared. The next 45 minutes felt like living inside a pressure cooker with the heat turned up incrementally, degree by degree, until the entire courthouse seemed on the verge of explosion. Marisol transcribed 3 more cases with mechanical precision while her mind churned through the implications of what she'd discovered. Every time Judge Keene spoke, every time Rourke grandstanded for the gallery, every dismissive comment and procedural shortcut got recorded in the official transcript, a document that would soon be examined by federal investigators with the power to dismantle careers and prosecute crimes. She watched Keene deny bail to a homeless veteran struggling with PTSD, watched him berate a young woman whose only crime was missing a court-ordered counseling session, watched him wield his authority like a weapon designed to punish rather than rehabilitate. And through it all, Marisol kept glancing at the clock above the courtroom door, watching the minutes tick away toward whatever reckoning was approaching. Rourke seemed oblivious to any undercurrent of tension. Between cases, he chatted with one of the bailiffs about weekend golf plans, his voice carrying that easy confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for anything. He'd built his reputation on cases exactly like Darius Cole's, defendants without resources, without support, without the sophistication to challenge the narrative being constructed around them. He treated Veterans Court like his personal audition stage for higher office, never questioning whether the scripts he performed were based on truth or convenient fiction. At 10:30, during a brief recess, Marisol excused herself to the restroom. Her hands shook as she gripped the sink, staring at her reflection in the institutional mirror. She looked pale, strained, like someone carrying knowledge too heavy for one person to bear alone. Agent Reeves had told her not to alert anyone, to proceed normally, but normal felt impossible when she knew what was coming. When she returned to the courtroom, she found Keene in conversation with his clerk, a nervous young man named Timothy who handled scheduling and paperwork with the terrified efficiency of someone who'd learned that mistakes in this courtroom came with verbal evisceration. Keene was complaining about something, his voice pitched just loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "I don't care what the public defender's office says about caseload, Tim. These defendants don't need attorneys holding their hands through every step. Half of them can barely string together a coherent sentence. We'd be here until Christmas if we had to wait for counsel on every petty case that comes through my docket." Timothy nodded frantically, scribbling notes on his legal pad. "Yes, Your Honor. I'll send another memo about streamlining the process." Marisol settled back into her station, her stomach churning. She'd heard variations of this speech dozens of times over the years. Keene's justification for running Veterans Court like an assembly line rather than a courtroom. It had always troubled her, had always felt like something hovering at the edge of illegality. But she'd told herself it wasn't her place to question a sitting judge's methods. Judges had discretion. Judges understood the law better than stenographers. Except now she knew that at least one person in this courthouse understood the law better than Royland Keene, and that person was currently sitting in a county jail cell, denied the very rights Keene claimed were unnecessary luxuries. At 10:45, the courtroom doors opened and a man in a dark suit entered. He moved with the deliberate purpose of someone accustomed to command, his eyes scanning the room with professional assessment. Marisol felt her pulse quicken. Was this one of the federal marshals? Had they arrived early? But the man simply took a seat in the back row of the gallery, pulled out a tablet, and began taking notes. Probably a law student observing court proceedings, Marisol told herself, though something about his bearing suggested otherwise. Keene called the next case, a 40-year-old veteran charged with public intoxication and trespassing. The defendant shuffled forward, clearly hungover or possibly still drunk, his public defender looking exhausted and overworked. The hearing lasted less than 10 minutes. Keene imposed the standard conditions: 90 days in the Veterans Program, weekly drug testing, community service, Monthly court appearances. The defendant agreed to everything with the defeated air of someone who'd learned that agreement was the only path to freedom. Another case. Another quick processing. Another veteran funneled through a system that claimed to help, but seemed designed primarily to maintain control. At 11:15, Marisol's phone buzzed silently in her pocket. She ignored it, keeping her focus on the keyboard, but her heart rate accelerated. When Keene called another recess, she checked the message. It was from an unknown number. Marshals arriving 11:30. Remain at your station. Do not leave the courtroom. Special Agent Chen. Marisol deleted the message immediately, then returned to her seat with legs that felt unsteady. 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, everything would change. She watched Rourke return to the prosecution table, watched him arrange his papers with the fastidious care of someone who believed presentation mattered more than substance. He caught her looking and offered a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. Marisol managed a neutral nod in return, wondering how that smile would hold up when federal agents walked through those doors. Keene resumed the bench at 11:20, glancing at his watch with visible irritation. Let's move through the rest of this docket efficiently, people. I have a lunch meeting at noon, and I'd prefer not to be late. He looked down at his clerk. What's next, Tim? Case 2024 VC 1951, Your Honor. Mr. Ramirez, failure to appear for drug testing. A thin man in his 50s approached the defense table, no attorney beside him. Keene didn't seem to notice or care about the absence of counsel. Mr. Ramirez, you missed 3 scheduled drug tests. Care to explain why I shouldn't revoke your program participation and send you to county for the full 90 days? Your Honor, I've been working double shifts at the warehouse, and the testing center closes at 5, and I don't get off until 6. And I tried to call to explain, but nobody answered, and so you're saying your job is more important than complying with court orders? Keene's voice carried that familiar edge of contempt. No, sir. I'm saying I've been trying to comply, but the schedule don't work with... The schedule works fine for everyone else in this program, Mr. Ramirez. If you can't manage basic compliance, perhaps you need more structured supervision. Bailiff, remand the defendant to county detention pending further review. Your Honor, please. I got kids who need... The gavel came down. 90 days, county jail, next case. Marisol's fingers flew across the keys, documenting the exchange while her internal clock screamed that it was 11:26 and the federal marshals were 4 minutes away, and Keene had just sent a man to jail for having a work schedule that conflicted with drug testing hours. She wanted to stand up, wanted to shout that this wasn't justice, wanted to do something other than sit silently recording words that destroyed lives. But Agent Reeves had told her to remain at her station, to proceed normally, and so she did, even as everything inside her rebelled against the normalcy of it all. At 11:28, the man in the dark suit who'd entered earlier stood up and walked quietly toward the exit. Marisol watched him go, wondering if she'd imagined the significance of his presence. Maybe he really was just a law student. Maybe she was so wound up with anticipation that she was seeing federal agents in every shadow. Keene was moving on to another case, his voice droning through standard questions about compliance and counseling attendance, when the courtroom doors opened again. This time, there was no mistaking who was entering. 3 people in dark suits, 2 men and 1 woman, moving with synchronized precision that spoke of training and authority. They didn't hurry, they didn't announce themselves. They simply walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with the kind of confidence that made everyone turn to look. The bailiffs noticed first. Their hands moved instinctively toward their service weapons, then froze as they processed the federal badges now visible on the newcomers' belts. Rourke glanced up from his notes, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion to something approaching alarm. Keene, mid-sentence in his questioning of the current defendant, trailed off as he registered the disruption. "Excuse me," he said sharply, his voice carrying irritation and authority in equal measure. "This is a closed proceeding. If you're here to observe, you need to..." The woman stepped forward, her hand moving smoothly to extract credentials from her jacket. Special Agent Sarah Chen, United States Marshals Service. Your Honor, I need you to pause all proceedings immediately. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Even the defendant at the table seemed to hold his breath, sensing that whatever was happening transcended his own legal troubles. Keen's face flushed the dangerous red that Marisol had learned to recognize as the precursor to explosive anger. Agent Chen, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you have no authority to interrupt my courtroom. I'm in the middle of— Your Honor, Chen interrupted, her voice respectful but unyielding. Approximately 90 minutes ago, you concluded a hearing involving a defendant named Darius Cole. Is that correct? Rourke was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, the prosecution objects to this intrusion. Whatever issues the federal government has can be addressed through proper channels, not by disrupting active court proceedings. Chen didn't even glance at Rourke. Her attention remained fixed on Keen. Your Honor, I asked you a question. Did you or did you not hold a hearing this morning involving Darius Cole? Keen's knuckles whitened against the bench. I hold dozens of hearings every week, Agent Chen. I'm not required to account for my docket to federal agents who barge into my courtroom without notice, or— Judge Keen. The second marshal spoke now, a tall man with silver hair and eyes like chips of granite. My name is Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison. I'm going to ask you to step down from the bench and accompany us to chambers. We have matters to discuss that require privacy. I'm not going anywhere, Keen snapped. This is my courtroom, and I don't take orders from federal marshals who— Morrison pulled a folded document from his inside pocket and held it up. Even from her station, Marisol could see the official seal. This is a federal warrant, Your Honor. It authorizes us to secure this courtroom, seize specific records, and detain certain individuals for questioning. You can cooperate voluntarily, or we can make this significantly more complicated for everyone involved. The color drained from Keen's face. For the first time since Marisol had known him, the judge looked genuinely uncertain. Warrant? On what basis? What possible authority? The basis is that you denied constitutional rights to a federal prosecutor conducting an undercover investigation into judicial misconduct in this courthouse, Chen said quietly. The authority is derived from Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, and the individuals subject to detention include yourself and District Attorney Gavin Rourke. Rourke's confident facade shattered like glass. This is insane. I'm a district attorney. You can't just— This is prosecutorial immunity. Prosecutorial immunity doesn't extend to criminal civil rights violations, Mr. Rourke. The third marshal, a younger Asian man, spoke for the first time. And it certainly doesn't protect you from conspiracy to violate constitutional rights under color of law. Keen found his voice again, though it emerged strained and higher than usual. Federal prosecutor? Darius Cole is a criminal defendant, not a— This is some kind of mistake, It's not a mistake, Your Honor. Chen's voice carried a weight that silenced the courtroom. Darius Cole is a senior trial attorney with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. For the past 6 weeks, he's been conducting an undercover investigation into allegations of systematic rights violations in Veterans Court. This morning, you denied him counsel, denied him due process, denied him a phone call, and remanded him without bail while threatening him with felony charges. All of which was done to a federal officer engaged in official duties, and all of which was recorded— She turned to look directly at Marisol— in the official court transcript. Every eye in the courtroom swiveled toward Marisol's station. She felt her face flush but kept her hand steady on the keyboard, kept her expression neutral, kept breathing despite the sudden attention. Keen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Rourke had gone pale, his hand gripping the edge of the prosecution table as if it were the only solid thing in a tilting world. The bailiffs looked at each other uncertainly, clearly unsure whether to follow their usual protocols or defer to federal authority. Morrison stepped forward, his voice gentler now but no less commanding. Judge Keen, I'm asking you again to step down from the bench and come with us voluntarily. We have a great deal to discuss, and it would be better for everyone if we handle this with dignity rather than drama. For a long moment, Keen didn't move. He stared down at the 3 federal marshals, at the warrant in Morrison's hand, at the courtroom that had been his kingdom for 11 years and was now suddenly foreign territory. Then slowly he stood. This is a mistake, he said, his voice lacking conviction. When my attorney reviews the facts, when the proper authorities understand the context— Your Honor, Chen said quietly, I'd advise you to stop talking until you've consulted with counsel. Everything you say from this point forward can and will be used in federal proceedings. The words hung in the air, The same warning Keene had undoubtedly heard defendants receive thousands of times, now being delivered to him in his own courtroom. The irony was so sharp that Marisol could almost feel it cutting through the stale air. Keene descended from the bench slowly, each step seeming to cost him something essential. Without the elevation of the judge's chair, without the protective barrier of the massive wooden bench, he looked smaller somehow, less formidable, just another man in an expensive suit facing consequences he'd never expected to encounter. Chen turned to Rourke, who was still gripping the prosecution table. "Mr. Rourke, we'll need you to come with us as well." "I want my attorney," Rourke said immediately, his prosecutor's instincts finally kicking in. "I'm not answering any questions without legal representation." "That's your right," Morrison acknowledged. "Though I'd note the irony of that request, given how you argued this morning that Mr. Cole didn't need counsel for what you characterized as a simple intervention hearing." Rourke's jaw tightened, but he had enough self-preservation instinct to remain silent. He gathered his leather portfolio with shaking hands and stepped away from the table. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The young defendant who'd been at the table when the marshals arrived, Mr. Ramirez, Marisol remembered, the one who'd just been sentenced to 90 days for missing drug tests, looked around in bewilderment. "Does this mean, am I still going to county, or—" Chen offered him a small, sympathetic smile. "Sir, I'd recommend you speak with the public defender's office about your case. All proceedings in this courtroom are suspended pending federal review." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The social workers in the gallery exchanged shocked glances. The handful of veterans waiting for their cases to be called looked at each other with expressions ranging from confusion to cautious hope. The reporter in the back row was typing furiously on his phone, clearly already filing the story that would dominate local news by the afternoon. Morrison gestured toward the door. "Gentlemen, if you'd come with us, please." Keene and Rourke walked toward the exit, flanked by the 3 federal marshals, a perp walk in everything but name. Just before they reached the door, Keene turned back toward the bench, toward the courtroom that had been his domain, and Marisol saw something flicker across his face. Disbelief, rage, fear, maybe all 3 at once. Then they were gone, and the heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind them. The silence that followed felt profound, almost sacred, like the moment after a storm when the world pauses to assess the damage. Marisol sat at her station, her hands still poised above the keyboard, her transcript frozen at the moment federal authority had superseded judicial power. One of the bailiffs, Officer Stevens, a decent man who'd always treated defendants with basic respect, cleared his throat. I guess court is in recess. What do we do with the people waiting for their hearings?" Before anyone could answer, the courtroom doors opened again. This time it was just Agent Chen returning alone. She surveyed the room with calm professionalism, then addressed the gallery. "Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, all proceedings in Veterans Court are suspended pending federal review. If you have cases scheduled for today, please check with the clerk's office for information about rescheduling. If you have questions about cases that have already been heard in this courtroom, I'd recommend contacting the Federal Public Defender's Office. Their contact information is available through the Courthouse Information Desk." She paused, letting that information sink in, then continued. "I want to be clear about something. This investigation is focused on specific individuals and specific practices. It is not an indictment of all veterans, all court programs, or all participants in this system. Many of you came here today seeking help, seeking justice, seeking a fair chance to rebuild your lives. That remains a valid and important goal. The federal government's interest is in ensuring that the process you encounter actually delivers on those promises." A woman in the gallery raised her hand tentatively. "Agent Chen, what about people who already took plea deals in this court? People who maybe didn't have lawyers and just agreed to whatever the judge recommended?" Chen's expression softened slightly. "That's an excellent question, and it's exactly the kind of issue that will be reviewed. I can't make specific promises about individual cases, but I can tell you that part of our investigation will examine whether defendants received adequate representation and whether plea agreements were entered into voluntarily with full understanding of rights and consequences." The woman nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. My son He took a deal 2 months ago. He didn't have a lawyer. The judge told him it was the only way to avoid prison. He's been in the program ever since, terrified of violating any rule, barely sleeping because he's so scared of messing up and getting sent away. I'm sorry your son went through that, Chen said quietly. I'd encourage you to contact the Federal Public Defender's Office and explain the situation. They'll be able to advise you on options. Another man stood up in the back. What about Darius Cole? The guy who got arrested. Is he okay? Chen's professional mask slipped just slightly, revealing something that might have been respect or admiration. Mr. Cole is being released from county detention as we speak. He'll be debriefed, he'll receive any necessary medical attention, and he'll continue his work with the Civil Rights Division. I can tell you that he conducted himself with extraordinary professionalism throughout this operation, even under circumstances that would have broken most people. Marisol's throat tightened. She thought about Darius standing in chains, speaking with that unshakable calm while being verbally eviscerated by a judge who thought he held all the power. She thought about the way he'd looked at her, thanking her for recording his request for basic rights. She thought about how he'd maintained his dignity even while being threatened with years in prison for crimes he didn't commit. And she thought about how he'd done all of it knowing that help was eventually coming, but having no idea when, having no guarantee that his colleagues would arrive before Keene succeeded in burying him completely in the system. Chen turned toward Marisol's station. Ms. Vega, I'm going to need you to secure your transcript files and prepare to provide copies to our investigative team. The official record you've created will be crucial evidence in the proceedings ahead. Marisol nodded, finding her voice. Of course, Agent Chen. I have everything backed up on the court server and on my local drive. Good. We'll also need you to remain available for interviews over the next several days. Your observations about courtroom practices, your knowledge of patterns and how cases were handled, that's all going to be valuable context. I'll help however I can, Marisol said quietly. Then, because she needed to know, Agent Chen, how long has Mr. Cole been investigating this courthouse? Chen smiled slightly. 6 weeks. He's attended hearings as an observer, interviewed former defendants, reviewed transcripts, and documented patterns. Then, 2 weeks ago, he went undercover as a defendant to experience the system firsthand. The Memorial Day incident was, well, it was partially staged to create a pretext for arrest, but the underlying facts were real. There really was a ceremony where Gold Star families were being charged premium prices. Mr. Cole really did question the organizers, and the police really did arrest him for it, exactly as we expected they would. But Judge Keene didn't know, Marisol said slowly. He thought he was processing just another defendant who'd stepped out of line. That's correct. Neither Judge Keene nor Mr. Rourke had any idea they were targeting a federal prosecutor, which means everything they did this morning, every rights violation, every threat, every instance of denied due process, they did because that's how they normally operate. They weren't trying to silence a federal investigation. They were just being themselves. The words landed like stones in still water, their implications rippling outward. How many defendants had Keene treated exactly the same way? How many people had been denied counsel, denied phone calls, denied basic constitutional protections because Keene had decided those rights were unnecessary luxuries? How many lives had been derailed, destroyed, or permanently damaged by a system that claimed to help veterans, but actually just processed them like products on an assembly line? Officer Stevens spoke up again, his voice troubled. Agent Chen, I've worked in this courthouse for 8 years. I've seen things that bothered me, things that felt wrong. But Judge Keene, he was appointed by the governor, confirmed by the state senate, evaluated every year by the Judicial Review Board. How does someone like that just get away with this for so long? Chen's expression hardened slightly. That's an excellent question, officer, and it's one we'll be examining closely. Systems like this don't persist without enablers. People who look the other way, people who prioritize institutional loyalty over individual rights, people who convince themselves that the ends justify the means. Part of our investigation will focus on identifying those enablers and determining whether they were complicit or simply negligent. The bailiff's face paled slightly. Marisol wondered if he was mentally reviewing every case he'd witnessed, every defendant he'd escorted, every hearing where he'd stood silently while Keene violated someone's constitutional rights. Chen checked her watch, then addressed the room one final time. "I need to get back to coordinate with my team, but before I go, I want to say something to everyone here." She looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with the social workers, the waiting defendants, the confused court staff. "What happened in this courtroom today is not normal. It shouldn't be normalized, and it's going to stop. Real accountability is coming. Not just political promises or administrative reviews, but actual federal prosecution of actual crimes. If you've been harmed by this system, if you've witnessed practices that violated people's rights, if you have information that could help ensure this never happens again, please come forward. Your voices matter, your experiences matter, and finally, after too long, someone is listening." She turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the silent courtroom. Just before she reached the door, she paused and looked back at Marisol. "Miss Vega, thank you for making that phone call this morning. You didn't have to verify Mr. Cole's identity. You didn't have to contact federal authorities. You could have stayed silent, stayed safe, stayed out of it. But you didn't, and because of that we were able to intervene before Judge Keene could do even more damage. That took courage." Marisol felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. I couldn't let it stand, not after everything I heard, not after watching him treat Mr. Cole that way." Chen nodded slowly. 16 years you've worked in this courthouse. 16 years of transcribing hearings, recording words, documenting what happened in these rooms. That's a heavy burden to carry, all that knowledge, all those stories. But today, that burden became evidence. Today, your records became the foundation for justice. Remember that. Then she was gone, and Marisol was alone in the courtroom with a handful of confused veterans, uncertain bailiffs, and the weight of 16 years of official transcripts that would now be examined by federal investigators looking for patterns of abuse. The social workers began quietly shepherding people out, explaining that they'd be contacted about rescheduling, offering resources and referrals. Officer Stevens approached Marisol's station, his expression troubled. "Marisol, did you really not know about Cole being federal?" She shook her head. "Not until after his hearing. I searched his name during recess and found his DOJ profile. Then I called to verify, and they told me marshals were coming." Stevens let out a long breath. "Jesus, and we all just stood there, while Keene did what he always does," Marisol finished quietly. "That's what makes this so damning, Frank. It wasn't personal animosity toward a federal prosecutor. It was just Tuesday morning in Veterans Court." The bailiff sank into one of the gallery benches, his face in his hands. "I should have said something. All those cases, all those defendants who didn't have lawyers, all the times Keene denied people basic rights, and I just stood there and let it happen." Marisol wanted to comfort him, wanted to say it wasn't his fault, but the words stuck in her throat. Because it was everyone's fault. Every person who'd witnessed the abuses and stayed silent, every court employee who'd normalized the violations, every official who'd reviewed Keene's performance and given him passing grades despite the mounting evidence that Veterans Court was broken. Herself included. She thought about all the transcripts she'd produced over the years, all the defendants she'd watched get railroaded, all the moments when she could have spoken up, could have filed complaints, could have done something other than type words into a computer, and tell herself it wasn't her job to judge. But today, finally, she'd made a different choice. Today she'd called the federal authorities and set in motion a chain of events that would echo through this courthouse for years to come. It felt simultaneously like the most important thing she'd ever done, and the very least she could have done much, much sooner. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Agent Chen. "Please secure all transcript files from the past 12 months. Full backup. We'll need everything for pattern analysis. Thank you again for your integrity." Marisol began the process of copying files, watching the progress bar creep across her screen while her mind replayed the morning's events. In a few hours, the news would break publicly. By tonight, every major outlet would be covering the story of a federal prosecutor who'd gone undercover in Veterans Court and exposed systematic rights violations. By tomorrow, there would be calls for investigations, resignations, reforms. But right now, in this moment, the courtroom was simply quiet, emptied of its usual authority, stripped of its pretense of justice, revealed as nothing more than a room where power had been abused behind the shield of judicial robes and official seals. Marisol looked at the judge's bench, at the empty chair where Royland Keane had sat for 11 years, and felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction that accountability was finally coming. Sorrow for all the people who'd needed it much sooner and hadn't received it. Outside, she could hear sirens, more federal vehicles arriving, she assumed, to begin the detailed work of documenting evidence and interviewing witnesses. The investigation that Darius Cole had started would continue now without him needing to endure any more abuse, without him needing to stand in chains while a corrupt judge tried to break his spirit. He'd succeeded. Against enormous personal cost, against genuine danger, against a system designed to crush people who challenged its authority, Darius Cole had succeeded in exposing the truth. And Marisol Vega, court stenographer, quiet observer, woman who'd spent 16 years recording words without questioning their weight, she'd helped him do it. That knowledge settled into her chest like something both heavy and weightless, both burden and liberation. The courtroom doors opened once more. A team of federal technicians entered with equipment cases, clearly preparing to image computers and secure physical evidence. They moved with calm efficiency, transforming the space from a courtroom into a crime scene, which, Marisol realized, was exactly what it had always been. The only difference was that now, finally, someone was investigating the crimes. The federal technicians worked with the methodical precision of archaeologists excavating a crime scene, which in many ways was exactly what they were doing. They photographed the courtroom from multiple angles, documented the layout, cataloged the arrangement of furniture that had been designed to intimidate rather than facilitate justice. One woman with FBI credentials spent 20 minutes examining the judge's bench itself, measuring sight lines, noting how the elevated position created a literal power differential that reinforced psychological dominance. Marisol watched them work while continuing to organize her own files, creating duplicate backups of every transcript from the past year as Agent Chen had requested. The data transfer seemed to take forever. Thousands of pages of testimony and rulings and procedural exchanges that had seemed routine at the time, but now felt like evidence of something systematic and cruel. Around 1 o'clock, a different federal agent approached her station. A woman in her early 30s with intelligent eyes and a softness in her expression that suggested she understood the emotional weight of what Marisol was processing. Ms. Vega, I'm Special Agent Lisa Tran, Civil Rights Division. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Marisol nodded, grateful for the interruption to her spiraling thoughts. Of course. Should we go somewhere private? Actually, I'd prefer to stay here if you're comfortable with that. Tran gestured toward the defense table where Darius had stood in chains just hours earlier. Sometimes context helps with recall, and honestly, I want to see this space the way defendants see it. They settled at the table, and Tran pulled out a leather notebook, old-fashioned in an era of tablets and digital recording. I want to start by acknowledging that what you did this morning took real courage. You could have looked the other way. Most people do. I spent 16 years looking the other way, Marisol said quietly. This morning was just the first time I couldn't live with myself if I kept doing it. Tran's expression remained neutral, but empathetic. Tell me about those 16 years. When did you first notice patterns that troubled you? The question opened something in Marisol that had been locked down for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. She found herself talking about her early days in the courthouse, about how she'd been idealistic and believed in the system's fundamental fairness. She described watching that idealism erode case by case, defendant by defendant, as she witnessed people being processed through Veterans Court like items on a conveyor belt. At first I told myself that Judge Keane was just efficient, Marisol explained, her fingers unconsciously moving as if typing even without a keyboard beneath them. That he understood veterans needed structure and discipline, not coddling. But over time, I started noticing patterns. Defendants without lawyers always got worse outcomes. People who questioned procedures were treated as hostile. Anyone who tried to assert their rights was labeled as difficult, uncooperative, dangerous. Tran made notes without looking down, maintaining eye contact. Did you ever witness Judge Keene denying people the right to counsel? Frequently. He has this line he uses, used, Marisol corrected herself, adjusting to the sudden past tense of Keene's authority. He'd say that Veterans Court was an intervention program, not a criminal proceeding, so the constitutional right to counsel didn't apply at the preliminary stages. He'd tell defendants they could have a lawyer later if they chose to reject the program and go to trial, but that accepting program terms didn't require legal representation. And did defendants understand that distinction? Did they knowingly waive their right to counsel? Marisol shook her head slowly. Most of them were scared, confused, sometimes actively experiencing mental health crises. They were told that signing program agreements was the only way to avoid jail. Judge Keene made it sound like having a lawyer would complicate things, would delay their release, would mark them as uncooperative. So they signed. They always signed. Tran's pen moved across the page. In your professional opinion, based on 16 years of observing these proceedings, did defendants typically understand their rights and the consequences of waiving them? No. The word came out flat, certain, carrying the weight of hundreds of cases. They understood that Judge Keene had the power to send them to jail or let them go home. That was the extent of their understanding, the legal nuances, the constitutional implications, the long-term consequences. Most of them had no idea. What about Mr. Cole's case this morning? Was there anything unusual about how Judge Keene handled it? Marisol considered the question carefully. The intensity was higher than usual. Judge Keene seemed personally offended by Mr. Cole's resistance. But the fundamental approach was the same as always. Deny counsel, deny due process, present program participation as the only alternative to incarceration, and punish anyone who questioned the system. You called the Department of Justice during recess, Tran said, shifting direction. What prompted that specific action today when you'd witnessed similar violations for years? The question cut deep, exposing the guilt that Marisol had been trying to avoid examining too closely. She took a breath, forcing herself to be honest. Mr. Cole was different. He spoke like someone who understood the law, not just as an abstract concept, but as a professional tool. He cited constitutional provisions correctly. He identified the specific violations as they were happening, and Judge Keene's response was to escalate, to add contempt charges, to threaten felony prosecution, to deny him even a phone call. It felt like watching someone be punished specifically for knowing their rights. And that bothered you more than previous cases? It bothered me differently, Marisol admitted. With most defendants, I could tell myself that maybe they really didn't understand the system. Maybe they really were better off in the program than going to trial. Maybe Judge Keene's approach was harsh, but ultimately helpful. But Mr. Cole clearly understood exactly what was being done to him, and he was being brutalized for that understanding. It made the abuse impossible to rationalize. Tran nodded slowly, her expression suggesting she'd heard similar accounts before. Did you ever file complaints about Judge Keene's practices? Report concerns to supervisory authorities? Shame heated Marisol's face. No. I told myself it wasn't my place to question a sitting judge. I told myself that if his methods were truly illegal, someone with more authority would have noticed and intervened. I told myself a lot of things to avoid acknowledging that I was complicit through my silence. You're being very honest, Tran said gently. That's important and it's appreciated. But I want you to understand something. You're not on trial here. We're not investigating court staff who witnessed abuses. We're investigating the people who committed them. Your willingness to speak truthfully now matters much more than your silence before. The words should have been comforting, but they only made Marisol's guilt sharper. How many defendants could have been spared if she'd spoken up years ago? How many lives had been damaged while she maintained professional neutrality? As if reading her thoughts, Tran leaned forward slightly. Ms. Vega, I've worked civil rights cases for 8 years. I've investigated corrupt police departments, abusive prison systems, discriminatory housing authorities. And you know what I've learned? Institutional abuse persists because it's institutional. It's not about individual witnesses failing to speak up. It's about systems that punish whistleblowers, that protect powerful people, that make silence the rational choice for anyone who wants to keep their job and their safety. You calling us this morning wasn't the first step toward accountability. It was the last step in a much longer process of evidence gathering that Mr. Cole had been conducting. You were the confirmation we needed, not the sole hero who should have saved everyone. Marisol felt tears threatening but forced them back. What happens now? To the cases that went through this courtroom? To the people who took plea deals without understanding their rights? That's still being determined, Tron admitted. But I can tell you that the Civil Rights Division takes these matters seriously. We'll be reviewing cases, identifying clear instances of rights violations, and working with the Federal Public Defender's Office to provide remedies. Some cases may be overturned. Some defendants may get new hearings with proper representation. Others may be released from program conditions that were imposed without valid consent. And Judge Keene, Mr. Rourke, Tran's expression hardened slightly. They're being interviewed separately right now. Depending on what that process reveals, they may face federal charges under Title 18, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. If convicted, they're looking at significant prison time. The idea of Royland Keene in prison, wearing the same orange jumpsuit he'd forced on countless defendants, experiencing the same powerlessness he'd inflicted on others, it should have felt like justice. Instead, Marisol just felt tired. "How is Mr. Cole?" she asked. Agent Chen said he was being released, but after everything Judge Keene put him through, "He's resilient," Tron said with something that might have been admiration. "I spoke with him briefly about an hour ago. He's more concerned about ensuring the evidence is preserved and the investigation proceeds properly than about his own treatment, which is typical for him, honestly. Darius doesn't do this work for personal vindication. He does it because he believes the system can be better." "I'd like to apologize to him," Marisol said suddenly, "for not speaking up sooner. For sitting there typing while Judge Keene abused him and not doing anything until after the fact." Tran smiled slightly. "I'll pass that along, but I suspect he'll tell you there's nothing to apologize for. You did exactly what the operation needed. You maintained your role, you documented everything accurately, and you made the call when you had information that required federal intervention. That's not complicity. That's professionalism under extraordinary pressure." Before Marisol could respond, the courtroom doors opened and Officer Stevens entered, his face pale and strained. He looked around at the federal technicians, at Tron and Marisol sitting at the defense table, at the transformation of his familiar workplace into something foreign and investigative. "Agent Tran, they're asking for you in chambers, something about financial records." Tran stood smoothly, tucking her notebook into her jacket. "Miss Vega, thank you for your time. We'll need a formal recorded interview later this week, but this conversation was extremely helpful. Officer Stevens," she turned to the bailiff, "someone from my team will want to speak with you as well. You've worked in this courthouse long enough to have valuable observations." Stevens nodded mutely, and Tran left them alone in the courtroom. The bailiff sank into one of the gallery benches, his usual military bearing completely absent. "This is really happening," he said quietly. "Federal investigation, potential prosecutions. The whole courthouse is going to be torn apart." "It should have been torn apart years ago," Marisol replied with more sharpness than she'd intended. "How many people did we watch Judge Keene destroy, Frank? How many veterans came here looking for help and left worse off than when they started?" Stevens met her eyes, his expression haunted. "I know. Believe me, I know. But what were we supposed to do? File complaints with who? The Judicial Review Board that consistently rated Keene as exemplary? The state court system that promoted Veterans Court as a model program? The governor's office that held up Keene as an example of tough but fair justice? We could have gone to the media. We could have contacted federal authorities ourselves. We could have done something other than show up every day and facilitate the abuse. And we'd have been fired, blacklisted, destroyed professionally," Stevens shot back. "You know how this works, Marisol. You go against a sitting judge, you don't get to keep working in the courthouse. You don't get good recommendations. You don't get to move to another jurisdiction because word travels. So you either accept the system as it is, or you give up your career." "Maybe some careers deserve to be given up," Marisol said quietly. "Maybe keeping our jobs wasn't worth the cost we were paying in other people's lives." Stevens had no answer to that. They sat in silence, two people who'd spent years being cogs in a machine that ground up vulnerable people and called it justice, now forced to confront exactly what they'd been part of. Around 3 o'clock, Agent Chen returned to the courtroom with two other people, a man in his 50s wearing a federal public defender's badge and a younger woman carrying a tablet loaded with what appeared to be case files. "Ms. Vega, Officer Stevens," Chen greeted them formally. "This is Dennis Hartley from the Federal Public Defender's Office and Maria Santos from the Civil Rights Division Case Review Team. They're going to be working through veterans' court cases to identify defendants who may need immediate relief." Hartley stepped forward, his expression grave but kind. "We're particularly interested in cases from the past 6 months, where defendants were denied counsel, where plea agreements were entered without adequate explanation of rights, or where sentences seem disproportionate to alleged offenses. Ms. Vega, your transcripts will be invaluable for this process." "I've backed up everything from the past year," Marisol told him. "Multiple copies. Agent Chen has the primary files, but I can provide additional access if needed." "What we really need," Maria Santos interjected, "is context. The transcripts show what was said, but they don't necessarily show what was understood or what coercive factors were present. Officer Stevens, you were in the courtroom for most of these proceedings. Can you help us identify cases where defendants seem particularly confused or frightened?" Stevens shifted uncomfortably. That's almost all of them. Most people who come through Veterans Court are dealing with trauma, addiction, mental health crises. They're not in any state to understand complex legal proceedings." "Exactly," Hartley said quietly, "which is why they should have had attorneys. Which is why what happened in this courtroom was such a profound violation of their constitutional rights. The enormity of it settled over them. Not just the cases from this morning, not just the past few months, but years of systematic rights violations affecting hundreds, possibly thousands of veterans who'd trusted the system to help them and instead encountered a judge more interested in control than justice." Chen's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then looked up with an expression that suggested significant developments. "The U.S. Attorney's Office has just announced that formal charges are being filed. Judge Royland Keene and District Attorney Gavin Rourke are being charged with conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law, making false statements to federal investigators, and obstruction of justice." Stevens's face went even paler. "Obstruction? What did they—" Apparently during their interviews, both men attempted to claim that Mr. Cole had never identified himself as a federal prosecutor, that he'd concealed his identity deliberately to entrap them, and that they would have behaved differently if they'd known his status. Chen's expression was grim. Unfortunately for them, the transcript clearly shows Mr. Cole attempting multiple times to assert his rights and request a phone call, requests that would have immediately resulted in federal notification if granted. Their attempt to rewrite what happened this morning constitutes obstruction of the ongoing investigation. "They lied to federal agents," Marisol said slowly, "after spending years telling defendants that honesty and accountability were paramount, after sending people to jail for minor violations while lecturing them about taking responsibility. The irony hasn't escaped anyone's notice," Chen confirmed. "Both men are currently being processed at federal detention. They'll have initial appearances tomorrow morning in front of a U.S. magistrate judge, where, incidentally, they'll be provided with court-appointed counsel if they can't afford their own attorneys. The parallel was too perfect, too karmically balanced to be anything but intentional. Keene and Rourke would experience exactly what they denied to countless others: the anxiety of detention, the powerlessness of standing before a judge who controlled your fate, the necessity of relying on an overworked public defender to protect your constitutional rights." Hartley cleared his throat. "Ms. Vega, Officer Stevens, I know this has been an overwhelming day, but I want you to understand that your cooperation moving forward is crucial. We're going to be reaching out to former defendants, informing them of potential case reviews, offering new hearings. Many of them are going to be skeptical. They've been burned by the system before. They're going to need to hear from people who were inside that courtroom, who witnessed what happened, who can confirm that this isn't just more empty promises." "You want us to testify," Stevens said. It wasn't a question. "Potentially, yes, depending on which cases move forward and what defenses are raised. But more immediately, we need you to be available for interviews to help us understand the full scope of what was happening here, to provide context that turns transcripts into evidence of systematic abuse." Marisol found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided. Whatever you need. I'll do whatever I can to help make this right. Stevens took longer, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he nodded as well. Same. I need you to understand that I never thought I was enabling abuse. I thought I was helping maintain order in a difficult system. I thought Judge Keene was harsh, but ultimately trying to help veterans get their lives together. A lot of people thought that, Chen said without judgment. That's how these systems persist. Good people tell themselves they're serving a greater purpose while participating in machinery that destroys individuals. The question isn't whether you were complicit before. The question is whether you're willing to seek accountability now. We are, Marisol said firmly, speaking for both of them. Whatever it takes. The afternoon dissolved into a blur of interviews, file reviews, and documentation. More federal agents arrived. The courthouse administrator appeared, looking shell-shocked and uncertain. The local news crews set up outside, their cameras capturing footage of federal vehicles and official-looking people moving with purpose. By evening, the story had gone national. Major outlets picking up the narrative of a federal prosecutor who'd gone undercover to expose judicial corruption. Marisol watched the news coverage on her phone while sitting in the now-empty courtroom, seeing the story reduced to headlines and sound bites that couldn't possibly capture the full weight of what had happened. Federal prosecutor arrested in undercover sting. Veterans court judge faces civil rights charges. Investigation reveals systematic denial of constitutional rights. All true. All accurate. All completely insufficient to convey the human cost of what Keene had done. Around 7 o'clock, as Marisol was finally preparing to leave, Agent Chen approached her one last time. Ms. Vega, there's someone who'd like to speak with you if you're willing. No pressure. You've already given us hours of your time today. Marisol looked up. Who? Mr. Cole. He's downstairs in one of the conference rooms, finishing his debrief. He asked specifically if he could thank you in person. Marisol's heart jumped. Yes, of course. Chen led her through the courthouse corridors, past familiar spaces that now felt strange and compromised, down to the administrative floor, where conference rooms were typically used for attorney-client meetings and settlement discussions. At the end of the hall, Chen stopped outside a closed door. He's been through a lot in the past 72 hours, Chen said quietly. County detention isn't pleasant under the best circumstances, and he spent 3 days there knowing that one wrong move could compromise the entire investigation. So if he seems tired or stressed, that's why. Chen knocked twice, then opened the door. The conference room was standard institutional, long table, uncomfortable chairs, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. And sitting at the far end of the table, wearing civilian clothes that must have been brought by a colleague since his own had been taken as evidence, was Darius Cole. He looked different without the orange jumpsuit and chains. Smaller somehow, more ordinary, just a man in his early 40s with tired eyes and the kind of quiet intensity that suggested deep reserves of strength carefully maintained. When he saw Marisol, he stood immediately, his posture still carrying traces of the military bearing that had been evident even in shackles. Miss Vega, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. His voice was the same, calm, measured, touched with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with everything he'd endured. Marisol found herself uncertain how to respond, how to bridge the gap between the defendant she'd watched being brutalized and the federal prosecutor who'd orchestrated the entire operation. I should be thanking you, she said finally. If you hadn't made that call this morning, if you hadn't verified my identity, the investigation timeline would have been very different, possibly compromised. I just did what seemed right, Marisol replied, feeling inadequate. What I should have done years ago for hundreds of other people. Darius shook his head slightly. You did what the situation required when it required it. That's all anyone can ask. Chen excused herself quietly, leaving them alone in the conference room. Marisol took a seat across from Darius, studying him more carefully now. There were shadows under his eyes, a tension in his shoulders that suggested pain being carefully managed, but his gaze remained steady and clear. How are you? Marisol asked. Really? Honestly, I'm angry. The admission came without heat, just factual acknowledgement. Not about what happened to me. I knew the risk going in, but about what I witnessed in that jail, the people I met who'd been processed through Keen's courtroom, who'd been denied representation, who'd been coerced into accepting program terms they didn't understand. There was a man in my cell block who'd been in the veterans program for 9 months, being drug tested 3 times a week, attending mandatory counseling, performing community service, all for a disorderly conduct charge that should have been dismissed or at most resulted in a fine. That's the pattern, Marisol said quietly. Take minor charges. Inflate them into major compliance burdens. Trap people in supervision that goes on for months or years. Judge Keen called it rehabilitation. The rest of us just watched it happen. You watched it happen while creating the documentation that's now going to dismantle the entire system, Darius corrected gently. Those transcripts you've been producing for 16 years? They're not just evidence of individual cases. They're proof of systematic practice. They show patterns, repeated violations, a consistent approach to denying rights. Without those records, we'd have anecdotes. With them, we have prosecution. Marisol felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite absolution, but perhaps the beginning of understanding that her role hadn't been entirely passive. The documentation itself could be a form of resistance even when it didn't feel like enough. I watched Judge Keen humiliate you this morning, she said, needing him to understand. I sat there typing while he denied you counsel, while he threatened you with felony charges, while he added contempt counts for asking basic questions, and I did nothing but record words. You recorded every word accurately and completely, Darius replied. You created an unimpeachable record that Judge Keen can't deny or explain away. That's not nothing, Ms. Vega. That's exactly what the Constitution's guarantee of due process requires, accurate documentation of proceedings so that abuses can be identified and challenged. But you didn't know I was going to call federal authorities, Marisol protested. You stood there in chains without any guarantee that help was coming, and you maintained your composure and insisted on your rights, even though it just made everything worse in the moment. How did you do that? Darius was quiet for a moment, his expression distant. I've spent my entire career investigating systems that abuse power, police departments that brutalize communities, prisons that torture inmates, courts that deny justice to the vulnerable. And every single time the pattern is the same. The abusers count on silence. They count on victims being too scared, too broken, too isolated to speak up. They count on witnesses looking away because intervention is uncomfortable or dangerous, or professionally risky. He leaned forward slightly, his intensity building. So when I design these operations, when I go undercover to experience these systems firsthand, I make a choice. I choose to be the person who doesn't stay silent, who insists on rights even when it's futile in the moment, who maintains dignity even when facing humiliation. Not because I think it'll change the immediate situation, I know it won't, but because every word, every interaction, every documented exchange becomes evidence, and evidence eventually becomes accountability. You sacrificed yourself to create that evidence, Marisol said softly. I accepted temporary hardship to create permanent change, Darius corrected. There's a difference. Sacrifice implies loss without purpose. What I experienced over the past 72 hours had very clear purpose. It revealed exactly how Judge Keen operates when he thinks he faces no consequences. And now he'll face all of them. Marisol studied Darius's face in the harsh fluorescent light of the conference room, searching for cracks in his composure, for signs of the trauma that 72 hours in county detention should have inflicted. But what she found instead was something harder to define, a kind of weathered resilience that spoke of battles fought long before this courthouse, wounds that had healed into scar tissue strong enough to bear additional weight. How long have you been doing this kind of work? She asked. Going undercover in broken systems? Darius leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more reflective. 7 years with the Civil Rights Division, but the foundation started earlier. I did 8 years in the Army, like I told Judge Keen. That part was true. 2 deployments, saw things that changed how I understood power and accountability. When I came back, I went to law school on the GI Bill. Graduated, passed the bar, could have gone into corporate law and made comfortable money defending companies against liability. He paused, his fingers drumming a quiet rhythm on the table surface. but I kept thinking about the guys I served with, the ones who came home broken and got chewed up by systems that were supposed to help them. Veterans' benefits denied on technicalities. Medical care delayed until treatable conditions became permanent disabilities. And courts, specialized veterans courts that were marketed as rehabilitation programs but operated like assembly lines designed to process people as quickly and cheaply as possible. "So you joined the Department of Justice to fix it," Marisol said. "I joined to document it," Darius corrected. "You can't fix problems people refuse to acknowledge exist. The first step is always evidence, clear, undeniable, documented proof that the abuse is real and systematic. That's what cases like this provide. Judge Keene can't claim he was having a bad day or that I misunderstood his intentions. We have transcripts showing he operates this way consistently. We have patterns spanning years. We have witnesses who worked in the system and can testify to the culture of rights denial." Marisol felt heat rise in her face. Witnesses like me. People who watched it happen and said nothing until a federal prosecutor got arrested. "People like you," Darius agreed without judgment, "who maintain detailed records that make prosecution possible. Do you know how many cases I've worked where abuse was obvious but undocumented? Where victims could testify about what happened but had no corroborating evidence? Those cases are incredibly difficult to prosecute because it becomes victim testimony against official denials, and juries tend to believe judges and prosecutors over defendants." He gestured toward the door, toward the courthouse beyond it, toward the 16 years of transcripts that Marisol had been copying all afternoon. "But this case is different. We don't need to rely solely on victim testimony. We have official court records showing exactly what Judge Keene said, how he responded to constitutional objections, what rights he denied, and why. That documentation transforms this from a he said, she said situation into something prosecutable." "Because I typed every word he said," Marisol murmured, understanding settling over her with a weight that felt simultaneously heavy and liberating. "Because you created an accurate record," Darius emphasized. "Even when what you were recording troubled you, even when you disagreed with what was happening. You didn't editorialize, you didn't omit uncomfortable exchanges, you didn't protect Judge Keene by sanitizing his statements. You did your job with integrity, and that integrity is now the foundation for accountability." Before Marisol could respond, the conference room door opened and Agent Chen entered carrying a folder thick with documents. Her expression was grim but satisfied, the look of someone who'd found exactly what they expected to find and wasn't happy about being right. "Mr. Cole, Ms. Vega, I thought you'd want to see this. Our forensic accountants just finished a preliminary review of Veterans Court financial records." She opened the folder, spreading several pages across the conference table. "It appears that Judge Keene and Mr. Rourke had a very creative approach to program funding." Darius stood and moved closer to examine the documents. His prosecutor's instincts immediately engaged. Marisol followed, though the columns of numbers and financial terminology initially meant little to her. Chen pointed to a highlighted section. Veterans court participants were required to pay various fees, program enrollment fees, drug testing fees, counseling fees, community service supervision fees, standard practice in many court-supervised programs. But what's not standard is where that money was going. "Let me guess," Darius said, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been present moments before. "The fees weren't going into general court administration funds." "Correct. They were deposited into a separate account ostensibly designated for Veterans Court Enhancement and Community Outreach. Sounds legitimate until you look at the disbursements." Chen flipped to another page. 70% of collected fees were paid out as administrative stipends to two individuals, Judge Royland Keene and District Attorney Gavin Rourke. Another 15% went to a consulting company that appears to exist solely on paper and lists Keene's brother-in-law as the registered agent. Marisol felt sick. They were profiting from the program, from people who could barely afford to eat, who were struggling with homelessness and addiction, who came to court looking for help. Keene and Rourke were extracting money and paying themselves. "Approximately $400,000 over the past 3 years, Chen confirmed, split between various accounts and shell entities, but ultimately flowing to their personal benefit. They created a system that funneled vulnerable people into mandatory supervision, imposed fees those people could barely afford, and then pocketed the proceeds while calling it rehabilitation. Darius's jaw tightened visibly. How many defendants were terminated from the program for failure to pay fees? Chen consulted another document. Based on case records, at least 87 participants over the past 2 years were found in violation of program terms specifically for non-payment of fees. Most were subsequently incarcerated for periods ranging from 30 days to 6 months. They sent people to jail for being too poor to pay fees that were funding their own salaries, Marisol said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's not justice. That's not even corruption. That's cruelty. It's also illegal under multiple federal statutes, Darius replied, his professional detachment reasserting itself though his eyes remained hard. Fee structures that disproportionately burden indigent defendants, incarceration for inability to pay, self-dealing by public officials, all prosecutable offenses. Agent Chen, has the U.S. Attorney's Office been briefed on these findings? They're reviewing the documents now. Expect additional charges to be filed by end of business tomorrow, likely including wire fraud, embezzlement of public funds, and honest services fraud. Darius nodded slowly, but Marisol could see something shifting in his expression, a tightness around his eyes that suggested pain beyond the professional. She remembered what he'd said earlier about the people he'd met in county detention, about the man who'd spent 9 months in the Veterans Program for a disorderly conduct charge. Mr. Cole, she said carefully, are you thinking about specific people? Defendants you met over the past few days who were trapped in this system? He was quiet for a long moment before responding. There was a woman named Patricia, Army veteran, served in Iraq, came back with PTSD and chronic pain from injuries sustained when her convoy hit an IED. She got arrested for possession of prescription medications that weren't prescribed to her, painkillers she'd bought from a friend because the VA kept denying her treatment requests. Judge Keene put her in the Veterans Program instead of prosecuting, which sounds merciful until you understand what that meant. Darius's voice remained level, but Marisol could hear the strain beneath it. Patricia had to report to the courthouse twice a week, attend 3 counseling sessions weekly, perform 20 hours of community service monthly, and submit to random drug testing that cost $50 per test. She was also required to pay a $200 monthly program fee, all while being prohibited from working more than part-time so she could maintain her reporting schedule. How was she supposed to afford all that on part-time wages? Marisol asked, though she already knew the answer. She couldn't. She fell behind on fees, got cited for program violations, appeared before Judge Keene to explain why she couldn't pay, and he sent her to jail for 30 days for failure to comply with program requirements. When she got out, the fees had accumulated with late penalties, and the cycle started over. Chen's expression was grim. We've identified her case as one requiring immediate review. The Federal Public Defender's Office is reaching out to her now. She's one of dozens, Darius continued, his control slipping slightly to reveal genuine anger. I met a young veteran, barely 23 years old, who got arrested for getting into a bar fight and was put in the program for assault charges that should have been reduced to disorderly conduct. He spent 18 months under supervision, paid thousands in fees, lost 2 jobs because of the reporting requirements, and ended up homeless because he couldn't afford both program costs and rent. By the time he completed the program, he was worse off than when he started. And Judge Keene probably congratulated himself on helping veterans, Marisol said bitterly. He absolutely did. I reviewed his public statements while preparing for this operation. He gave speeches to civic organizations about his commitment to veterans' welfare. He wrote op-eds about the importance of rehabilitation over incarceration. He positioned himself as a champion of those who served, all while systematically exploiting them for personal profit. The conference room door opened again, and this time it was Deputy Marshal Morrison who entered, his expression carrying the particular gravity that preceded significant announcements. Mr. Cole, Agent Chen, the U.S. Attorney wants to brief you on developments. Ms. Vega, you're welcome to sit in if you'd like. Much of this will become public knowledge shortly, anyway. They moved to a larger conference room down the hall, where U.S. Attorney Rebecca Walsh was waiting with several assistants and what appeared to be a video conference setup. Walsh was a woman in her late 40s with steel gray hair and the kind of focused intensity that suggested she hadn't built her career by backing down from difficult fights. Mr. Cole, glad to see you in one piece, Walsh said, shaking his hand firmly. I've been reviewing your reports and the supporting documentation. Excellent work under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Thank you, ma'am. Though the credit belongs to a lot of people. Agent Chen and her team, Ms. Vega for maintaining accurate records, everyone who contributed to building this case. Walsh gestured for them to sit. Let's talk about where we stand. As of 2 hours ago, Judge Royland Keene and District Attorney Gavin Rourke have been formally charged with conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law, making false statements to federal investigators, and obstruction of justice. Based on the financial evidence that just came to light, we'll be adding charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and honest services fraud by tomorrow morning. She pulled up a document on the video screen. Here's what we're looking at in terms of potential penalties. The civil rights conspiracy carries up to 10 years. False statements, 5 years per count. Obstruction, up to 20 years. Wire fraud, 20 years. We're structuring the charges to reflect multiple victims and a sustained pattern of abuse, which means we're likely looking at sentencing guidelines that recommend significant prison time, even with cooperation and guilty pleas. Marisol absorbed the numbers with a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Years of people's lives destroyed, and the architects of that destruction were finally facing consequences that actually mattered. But it didn't undo the damage, didn't restore what had been taken from the veterans who'd trusted the system to help them. What about the victims? Darius asked, echoing Marisol's thoughts. The defendants who were processed through Veterans Court under these conditions? What remedies are available? Walsh nodded as if she'd been expecting the question. We're working with the Federal Public Defender's Office to establish a review process. Every case that went through Veterans Court in the past 5 years will be examined for potential rights violations. Defendants who were denied counsel, coerced into plea agreements, or subjected to unconstitutional conditions will be offered new hearings with proper representation. Those who were incarcerated for inability to pay fees will be released immediately and have their records corrected. 5 years? Chen questioned. The financial records only go back 3 years. But the patterns of rights denial, those have been happening much longer. We're limited by statutes of limitations for some charges, Walsh acknowledged, but the civil rights violations don't have the same time constraints. We can go back further for those. And frankly, the discovery process is likely to reveal additional evidence that extends our timeline. Keene and Rourke weren't sophisticated about covering their tracks. They genuinely believed they were untouchable. Morrison spoke up from his position near the door. We executed search warrants at both their residences this afternoon. Preliminary inventory shows extensive financial records, personal correspondence that's going to be very interesting in context, and in Keene's case, what appears to be a journal where he documented his philosophy of Veterans Court management. Please tell me he wrote down his justifications for denying people constitutional rights, Darius said with dark humor. Better. He wrote extensive entries about specific defendants, including commentary that's going to be Exhibit A in demonstrating bias and prejudgment. There's an entry about a defendant he describes as typical street trash pretending military service entitled him to special treatment, who he was determined to teach a lesson about respect for authority. The defendant in question was a decorated Marine with 2 Purple Hearts. Marisol closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the depth of Keene's contempt for the very people he was supposed to be helping. He really believed he was doing the right thing. That's what makes this so disturbing. He wasn't a cynical actor who knew he was corrupt. He genuinely thought he was serving justice. A lot of abusers think that, Darius said quietly. It's easier to maintain systematic cruelty if you've convinced yourself it's actually kindness. Keene told himself he was being tough because veterans needed discipline. He told himself he was denying counsel because legal representation would complicate the helping process. He told himself he was extracting fees because people needed to have skin in the game to take rehabilitation seriously. And he told himself all of this while depositing their money into his personal accounts. Walsh pulled up another document on screen. Speaking of which, we've frozen all accounts associated with the Veterans Court Enhancement Fund and related entities. Total assets currently identified are approximately $600,000. That money will be held as evidence and eventually distributed to victims as restitution, but the process will take time. What about immediate relief? Marisol asked. The people who are in jail right now for program violations. The ones who are homeless because they couldn't afford both rent and Keene's fees. They can't wait for the legal process to run its course. We've already started addressing that, Walsh assured her. As of 6 o'clock this evening, the state court administrator issued an emergency order suspending all Veterans Court proceedings and releasing anyone currently incarcerated solely for program violations. That's approximately 34 people who will be out by midnight tonight. Additionally, we're working with local social services to provide emergency housing assistance and connect people with legitimate veterans support programs. Chen added, the VA has also been notified and is sending a crisis intervention team to do outreach with affected veterans. Many of them have been so traumatized by their experience with Veterans Court that they've avoided seeking help from any official programs. We need to rebuild that trust. That's going to take more than crisis intervention, Darius observed. These people were betrayed by a system that specifically claimed to serve their needs. They were told Veterans Court existed to help them, and instead it exploited and abused them. Some of them are never going to trust institutional support again. The weight of that reality settled over the room. Keene and Rourke would face prosecution and likely prison time. The financial exploitation would be documented and punished. Cases would be reviewed and remedies provided. But the deeper damage, the erosion of trust, the trauma of betrayal, the psychological wounds of being victimized by people who claim to care, that couldn't be fixed with legal proceedings and restitution payments. Walsh seemed to sense the somber shift in mood. I know this feels incomplete. I know that no amount of prosecution can truly make whole the people who are harmed. But what we can do is ensure accountability, establish precedent, and send a clear message that this kind of abuse will not be tolerated. Every case we prosecute successfully makes it harder for the next corrupt official to rationalize their actions. And every case we prosecute, Morrison added, gives victims a measure of validation. Their experiences are being taken seriously. Their complaints weren't ignored or dismissed. The system that failed them is being held accountable, even if that accountability comes too late for some. Marisol thought about the defendants she'd watched flow through Veterans Court over 16 years, the faces that blurred together into a mass of desperation and resignation. How many of them had hoped that someone would notice? How many had tried to assert their rights only to be shut down by Keene's authority? How many had given up entirely, accepting the abuse as just another instance of the world failing to care about their suffering? Ms. Vega, Walsh said, pulling her from those dark thoughts, I understand you've been working in this courthouse for 16 years, that you've transcribed hundreds of these proceedings. I want you to know that your records are going to be central to this prosecution, but more than that, they're going to be central to the reform process that comes after. Reform? Marisol asked. This case is going to generate significant attention, Walsh explained. Veterans courts exist in jurisdictions across the country, and while many of them operate legitimately and provide real help, others have similar problems to what we found here. Your documentation of how abuse manifests in these specialized courts, the specific language used to deny rights, the procedural shortcuts that violate due process, the fee structures that exploit rather than rehabilitate, that's going to inform policy reform at the federal level. Darius leaned forward, his exhaustion temporarily overcome by professional interest. The Department of Justice has been developing best practice guidelines for specialty courts. This case is going to provide concrete examples of what not to do and why. It's going to be required reading for every judge, prosecutor, and court administrator who works in veterans programs. So the records I created, Marisol said slowly, aren't just evidence in this specific prosecution. They're documentation of systematic problems that exist beyond this courthouse. Exactly, Walsh confirmed, which is why we need you to remain engaged with this process. We'll need your testimony, certainly, but we'll also need your expertise. You've observed these proceedings longer than anyone. You understand the patterns, the justifications, the ways that abuse gets normalized and perpetuated. That knowledge is invaluable. The conversation continued for another hour, covering logistics of the investigation, timeline for additional charges, coordination with state authorities who were launching their own reviews of veterans' court operations. Throughout it all, Marisol found herself watching Darius. The way he engaged with the legal analysis despite obvious physical exhaustion, the way his questions consistently focused on remedies for victims rather than punishment for perpetrators, the way he maintained professional focus while clearly carrying the emotional weight of what he'd witnessed over the past weeks. When the meeting finally concluded, Walsh pulled Darius aside for a private conversation while Chen walked Marisol back toward the main courthouse. The building was mostly empty now, just security personnel and a few federal agents still processing evidence. Their footsteps echoed through corridors that had been filled with activity earlier in the day. "Ms. Vega," Chen said as they walked, "I want to make sure you understand what you're likely to face in the coming weeks. This case is going to attract significant media attention. Your name will probably come up as a key witness. You may receive interview requests, possibly criticism from people who are loyal to Judge Keene, maybe even subtle retaliation from colleagues who view you as a whistleblower." Marisol had been trying not to think about those possibilities, but hearing them stated plainly made them unavoidable. What kind of retaliation? Usually nothing overt. That would be illegal and would compound the federal investigation. But subtle things, being excluded from social interactions, getting assigned to less desirable cases or shifts, colleagues questioning your motives, or suggesting you're seeking attention. The courthouse culture is going to be fractured between people who are grateful the abuse is being exposed and people who are defensive about their own complicity. "I can handle gossip," Marisol said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "What I can't handle is going back to business as usual and pretending this never happened." "That won't be an option," Chen assured her. "Veterans Court is suspended indefinitely pending restructuring. You'll likely be reassigned to other dockets while that process unfolds. And given your cooperation with the federal investigation, you'll have protection from any formal retaliation. But the informal pressure, that's harder to prevent." They reached the courthouse entrance where Marisol's car was parked in the employee lot. The evening air was cool and carried the smell of coming rain. Chen extended her hand. "Thank you again for your courage today. You made a choice that a lot of people in your position wouldn't have made. That matters." Marisol shook her hand, feeling the weight of the day settling into her bones. "Agent Chen, can I ask you something? Mr. Cole spent 72 hours in detention experiencing abuse firsthand. He maintained his composure, played his role, did everything necessary to document the violations. But nobody's really asked how he's doing. Not emotionally, not psychologically. Everyone's focused on the investigation and the evidence and the prosecution. Is he okay?" Chen's expression softened. "Honestly, probably not, at least not yet. Darius has done multiple undercover operations, and each one takes a toll. He's exceptionally good at compartmentalizing, at maintaining focus on the mission even when experiencing personal trauma. But that compartmentalization has costs. He'll debrief, he'll write his reports, he'll testify when needed, and then eventually, usually weeks or months later, the delayed impact hits him. Does he have support? People checking on him? He has colleagues who understand the work. He has mandatory counseling through the department. And he has a kind of professional community among people who do this kind of investigation. They look out for each other because they know the psychological burden involved." Chen paused, then added, "But if you're asking whether he has someone personally invested in his well-being beyond professional obligation, I honestly don't know. Darius is intensely private about his personal life, very dedicated to the work, sometimes at the expense of everything else." Marisol nodded slowly, filing that information away with everything else she'd learned today. She thanked Chen again and walked to her car, but before driving away she sat in the parking lot for several minutes, watching the courthouse in a rearview mirror. Lights glowed in some windows where federal agents continued their work. The building looked the same as it had this morning, as it had for all the years she'd worked there, but everything about it had fundamentally changed. Marisol drove home through streets that felt unfamiliar, despite having traveled them for 16 years, as if the events of the day had altered not just the courthouse, but the entire landscape of her life. Her apartment was dark and silent when she arrived, a small one-bedroom space that suddenly felt too quiet, too empty, too inadequate a sanctuary after the emotional intensity of everything she'd witnessed. She stood in her kitchen without turning on the lights, staring at her reflection in the window, and seeing a stranger looking back, someone who'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade, who'd stepped across a threshold that had no path leading backward. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Darius standing in chains, while Judge Keene's voice dripped contempt, saw the faces of defendants she'd watched being processed through a system designed to break rather than heal, saw the spreadsheets detailing how Keene and Rourke had transformed human suffering into personal profit. Around 3 in the morning, she gave up on rest entirely and sat at her laptop, opening news sites to see how the story was being covered. The headlines were stark and damning. Federal prosecutor exposed corruption while in chains. Veterans court judge arrested for civil rights violations. Systematic abuse documented in specialty court program. The articles pulled no punches, describing the financial exploitation, the denial of constitutional rights, the targeting of vulnerable veterans who'd trusted the system to help them. Several outlets had already obtained copies of court transcripts, redacted but still revealing in their documentation of Keene's methods. By morning, Marisol's phone was filled with messages, colleagues asking if she was okay, if the news reports were accurate, if she'd really been the one to call federal authorities. A few messages carried support and gratitude. Others were more circumspect, carefully worded in ways that suggested disapproval wrapped in concern. The courthouse administrator sent an official notification that all court staff should report to work as normal, but expect potential reassignments while Veterans Court remained suspended. Marisol arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 to find a media circus camped outside. Satellite trucks lined the street, reporters doing stand-ups with the courthouse as backdrop, cameras capturing every person who entered or exited the building. She kept her head down and moved quickly through the crowd, declining to answer the questions shouted in her direction. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued and tense. Court employees clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices that fell silent when she passed. Marisol could feel their eyes following her, could sense the mixture of curiosity, judgment, and uncertainty that her presence provoked. She'd become a symbol overnight, either of courage and integrity or of betrayal and ambition, depending on who was doing the interpreting. She found Officer Stevens in the security checkpoint area, his face drawn and exhausted. They exchanged a look that communicated volumes without requiring words, shared acknowledgement of the weight they were both carrying, mutual understanding that their lives had fundamentally changed in ways they were still processing. "Federal agents want to see us at 9, Stevens said quietly. "Conference room B, something about victim notification procedures." The meeting turned out to involve a much larger group than Marisol had anticipated. Dennis Hartley from the Federal Public Defender's Office was there, along with Agent Chen, 2 representatives from the VA's Crisis Intervention Team, a Victim Services Coordinator from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and several social workers who'd previously been assigned to Veterans Court. The conference room felt crowded, the air thick with tension and purpose. Hartley took the lead, his expression carrying the particular gravity of someone about to describe both terrible harm and the beginning of remediation. "Thank you all for being here. We're about to begin the process of contacting every defendant who went through Veterans Court in the past 5 years. That's approximately 800 individuals, many of whom experienced constitutional violations, financial exploitation, or both. This is going to be complex, sensitive, and emotionally difficult work." He pulled up a presentation on the screen at the front of the room. "We've divided the cases into priority tiers. Tier 1 includes anyone currently incarcerated for program violations. Those individuals are being released immediately and will receive priority assistance. Tier 2 covers defendants who completed programs but did so without adequate legal representation or under coercive conditions. Tier 3 includes everyone else who went through the system, regardless of outcome." One of the VA representatives spoke up. "Many of these veterans are going to be deeply traumatized by their experience. They trusted a system that claimed to serve them and instead got exploited and abused. When we reach out, we need to be prepared for anger, skepticism, and potentially outright hostility toward any official program." "That's exactly right," Hartley acknowledged, "which is why we're not approaching this as a typical legal notification process. Every outreach will be done by teams that include both legal counsel and mental health support. We're not just offering case reviews, we're offering comprehensive assistance including housing support, medical care coordination, benefits navigation, and therapeutic services." Marisol listened as they outlined the logistics, the protocols, the careful balance between legal necessity and human compassion that would guide their approach. She found herself thinking about specific defendants she remembered: the young veteran who'd lost his housing because of program fees, the woman named Patricia who Darius had mentioned, the elderly man with Purple Hearts who'd been denied a seat at a Memorial Day ceremony and then criminalized for objecting. "Ms. Vega," Hartley said, pulling her attention back to the present. We're going to need your help identifying cases where the transcript evidence clearly demonstrates rights violations. You know these records better than anyone. You can spot the patterns, the language Keene used to coerce compliance, the moments when defendants tried to assert their rights and were shut down. I can do that, Marisol said, her voice steadier than she felt. I've been reviewing transcripts in my head all night anyway. I can probably identify at least 50 cases off the top of my head where the violations were egregious and well documented. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, covering everything from media protocols to security concerns to the emotional support that would be available for staff members who were struggling with their own complicity in what had happened. By the time it concluded, Marisol had been assigned to a review team that would spend the next several weeks going through transcripts and identifying priority cases for immediate intervention. As people filed out of the conference room, Agent Chen touched Marisol's arm gently. "Can you spare a few more minutes? There's someone who wanted to see you." They walked down the corridor to a smaller office that had been temporarily converted into a federal workspace. Inside, looking considerably more rested than he had the previous evening, but still carrying visible strain around his eyes, was Darius Cole. He stood when they entered, his posture still maintaining that military bearing despite obvious exhaustion. "Miss Vega, thank you for coming. I know you've had a long morning already." "No longer than yours, I imagine," Marisol replied, taking the seat he offered. Chen excused herself and closed the door, leaving them in relative privacy. Darius settled back into his chair with a slight grimace that suggested his body was still recovering from 3 days in county detention. "I wanted to talk to you before the case moves into the more formal prosecution phase. Once that happens, there are going to be restrictions on communication, witness protocols, all the machinery of federal criminal proceedings. But right now, while we still have some flexibility, I wanted to say something I should have said yesterday." He paused, gathering his thoughts with visible care. "What you did, calling federal authorities when you recognized the violations happening in real time, that wasn't just helpful to the investigation. It was an act of moral courage that probably saved lives. There were defendants scheduled for hearings after mine, people who would have been processed through Keene's system, denied their rights, coerced into accepting terms they didn't understand. Your intervention stopped that assembly line before it could harm anyone else." Marisol felt tears threatening and forced them back. "I should have stopped it years ago. I should have spoken up the first time I saw Judge Keene deny someone counsel, the first time I watched him coerce a plea, the first time I documented violations and did nothing but type them into the official record." "You created the evidence that made accountability possible," Darius countered firmly. "Those transcripts you've been producing for 16 years, they're not monuments to your silence, Miss Vega. They're documentation that systematic abuse was happening. Without those records, we'd have victim testimony that defense attorneys could cross-examine and challenge. With your transcripts, we have undeniable proof of what Keene said, how he operated, what patterns he established. That's not complicity. That's the foundation of justice." "It doesn't feel like justice," Marisol said quietly. "It feels like too little, too late, for too many people who needed help much sooner." Darius was silent for a long moment, his expression suggesting he understood that feeling more deeply than she'd realized. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of personal experience that transcended professional detachment. "I've been doing this work for 7 years. Civil rights investigations, pattern or practice reviews, prosecutions of officials who abuse their authority. And every single case, no matter how successful the outcome, leaves me with the same feeling you're describing. The awareness that accountability is always reactive, always comes after harm has been done, always fails to make whole the people who suffered while the system was broken." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity building. "But here's what I've learned. Imperfect justice is still justice. Late accountability is still accountability. And every case we prosecute successfully makes the next abuse slightly harder to perpetrate, slightly more likely to be caught, slightly less sustainable in the long term. We can't undo the harm Keene and Rourke inflicted, but we can ensure they face consequences. We can help their victims rebuild, and we can establish precedents that protect future defendants from similar abuse." "Is that enough?" Marisol asked. "For you personally, after everything you experienced over the past 3 days, Is knowing that you've established precedent and created accountability enough to balance the cost? Darius didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, at the faint marks where restraints had chafed his wrists, and Marisol saw something in his expression that suggested layers of accumulated trauma, carefully managed but never fully resolved. "No," he said finally. "It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's what I can do. It's the contribution I can make toward bending that arc toward justice, even knowing the arc is longer than any individual lifetime, and the bending happens in increments so small they're almost imperceptible." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "The alternative is to do nothing, to accept that abuse is inevitable, that power will always corrupt, that vulnerable people will always be exploited, and I can't accept that. So I do this work, knowing it's insufficient, knowing it comes too late for too many people, but also knowing that it's necessary and meaningful, and sometimes, it actually changes things." Before Marisol could respond, there was a knock on the door. Agent Chen opened it partially, her expression apologetic. "Mr. Cole, sorry to interrupt, but the U.S. Attorney needs you for a press conference in 20 minutes. We should start prepping." Darius nodded, then turned back to Marisol. "I have to go, but please, if you need anything as this process unfolds, resources, support, someone to talk to who understands the weight of what you're carrying, Agent Chen can connect you with me. You don't have to navigate this alone." "Thank you," Marisol managed. "And Darius?" She used his first name deliberately, establishing a connection beyond their professional roles. "Take care of yourself too. I know everyone's focused on the prosecution and the victims, but you were victimized too. Don't forget that." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, or gratitude, or recognition that someone had seen past his professional armor to the human being beneath it. "I'll try to remember that," he said softly, then stood and followed Chen out of the office. The press conference happened at noon in front of the courthouse, a carefully orchestrated presentation designed to control the narrative and provide official information to media outlets that had been speculating wildly for the past 18 hours. U.S. Attorney Rebecca Walsh stood at a podium flanked by Darius, Agent Chen, and several other federal officials, her voice carrying clear authority as she outlined the charges, the investigation, and the ongoing efforts to provide remedies to victims. Marisol watched on a television in the courthouse break room, surrounded by colleagues who maintained uncomfortable silence as Walsh described the systematic abuses that had characterized Veterans Court operations. The camera occasionally cut to Darius, standing quietly to the side, his expression professionally neutral even as Walsh recounted his experience being denied counsel, denied due process, and threatened with felony charges for asserting his constitutional rights. When the press conference concluded and reporters began shouting questions, Walsh held up a hand for silence. "Before we take questions, I want to address something directly. This investigation succeeded because brave individuals chose to come forward, chose to document abuses, chose to prioritize justice over institutional loyalty. That courage deserves recognition and protection. Any attempt to retaliate against witnesses, any effort to intimidate or punish people who cooperated with federal authorities will be prosecuted as obstruction of justice. That's not a warning, it's a commitment." The message was clearly directed at courthouse employees, at state officials who might be tempted to protect their own by targeting those who'd exposed the corruption. Marisol felt eyes turning toward her in the break room and met their gazes steadily, drawing strength from Walsh's public declaration of support. The following days blurred together in a haze of interviews, document review, and coordination meetings. Marisol spent hours going through transcripts with federal prosecutors, marking passages that demonstrated patterns of abuse, providing context about Keen's methods, and the culture that had enabled them. She met with victim services coordinators to help identify defendants who'd been particularly harmed and needed immediate outreach. She gave a recorded deposition that stretched across 6 hours, recounting 16 years of observations and professional experience in excruciating detail. By the end of the first week, the scope of what had been uncovered was staggering. Federal investigators had identified not just the financial exploitation, but also evidence that Keen had manipulated case assignments to ensure certain defendants appeared before him rather than other judges, had coordinated with Rourke to inflate charges against people who challenged the system, and had actively obstructed efforts by defense attorneys to provide adequate representation to their clients. The shell corporation that received 15% of program fees turned out to be connected to a network of entities that Keene and his family members controlled, transforming Veterans Court into what prosecutors were describing as a criminal enterprise masquerading as a rehabilitation program. Additional charges were filed. Keene and Rourke, who'd initially been released on bond, had those bonds revoked after prosecutors demonstrated they'd attempted to contact witnesses and destroy evidence. Both men were remanded to federal detention, the same facility where Darius had spent 72 hours, though with considerably more comfortable accommodations given their status as former officials rather than pretrial defendants. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the media, which ran stories comparing their treatment to how they'd treated the veterans who'd appeared before them. Keene's attorney issued a statement claiming his client had been unfairly targeted, that Veterans Court had operated within normal parameters for specialty courts, that the charges were politically motivated. The statement fell flat in the face of overwhelming documentary evidence, including Keene's own journal entries describing defendants in terms that ranged from contemptuous to openly hostile. 2 weeks after the initial arrests, Marisol received a call from Dennis Hartley, asking if she'd be willing to attend a meeting with some of the victims who'd been identified as priority cases. "They're scared," Hartley explained. "They've been contacted by federal authorities offering help, but after what they experienced with Veterans Court, a lot of them don't trust official programs. Some of them have asked specifically if they could speak with you, the court stenographer who documented what happened to them. They want to hear from someone who was inside the system but isn't a lawyer or prosecutor or social worker." Marisol agreed without hesitation, and 3 days later found herself in a community center conference room facing a group of about 20 veterans whose ages ranged from early 20s to late 70s. Their faces carried the particular exhaustion of people who'd been failed by systems designed to help them, people who'd learned through bitter experience that authority figures claiming to care often had ulterior motives. She recognized some of them from their court appearances, though seeing them in civilian clothes without the orange jumpsuits or the defeated posture of defendants made them seem simultaneously more human and more fragile. A woman in her 40s with haunted eyes met Marisol's gaze and offered a small, uncertain nod of recognition. Hartley made brief introductions, explaining Marisol's role and emphasizing that she was there voluntarily to answer questions and provide perspective. Then he stepped back and let Marisol speak. "I don't know what to say to you that would adequately address what you experienced," she began, her voice carrying into the quiet room. "I was in that courtroom for 16 years. I transcribed your hearings. I documented the things Judge Keene said to you, the rights he denied you, the ways he manipulated and exploited your trust. And I did nothing to stop it until 2 weeks ago when I finally found the courage to call federal authorities." She paused, forcing herself to maintain eye contact even as shame heated her face. "That's my failure. That's my burden to carry. But what I want you to understand is this. Your experiences were real. The abuse you suffered was systematic and intentional, and every word of it is documented in official court transcripts that are now being used to prosecute the people who harmed you." A man in the back raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, I spent 9 months in that program, paid thousands of dollars in fees, lost my job because I had to report to court twice a week, ended up homeless. And the whole time, Judge Keene kept telling me it was for my own good, that I needed to take responsibility, that the program was helping me. Was any of that true? Was he actually trying to help?" Marisol took a breath, considering how to answer honestly without causing additional harm. "I think Judge Keene believed he was helping, at least initially. But somewhere along the way, the program became more about control and profit than rehabilitation. He convinced himself that being harsh was the same as being effective, that denying people rights was acceptable if it served the larger goal of changing their behavior. And once the financial incentives were established, once he was profiting personally from the fees you were paying, any pretense of helping became secondary to maintaining the system that enriched him." The woman who'd nodded earlier spoke up, her voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I'm Patricia. I was mentioned in some of the news coverage, the veteran who got sent to jail for falling behind on program fees while dealing with PTSD and chronic pain. I just want to know if people understand what that did to me. If anyone in authority actually cares that I was treated like a criminal for being poor and disabled." "People care. Marisol assured her, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The federal prosecutors care. The victim services teams care. The mental health professionals who are working to provide support care. And yes, there are people in the courthouse, people like me, like Officer Stevens, like some of the public defenders who tried to help within an impossible system, who care deeply about what happened to you. Caring isn't the same as accountability, another veteran interjected, his voice sharp with anger. Caring doesn't give me back the months I spent in that program, doesn't restore my credit that got destroyed when I couldn't pay the fees, doesn't fix my relationship with my kids who lost respect for me because I kept getting arrested for program violations. You're absolutely right, Marisol acknowledged. Caring isn't enough, which is why accountability is happening, real, meaningful, criminal accountability. Judge Keene and District Attorney Rourke are facing federal charges that carry decades in prison. They're being prosecuted by the same system they abused, experiencing the same powerlessness they inflicted on you. And beyond their individual prosecutions, there are reforms being implemented to prevent this from happening again. She spent the next 2 hours answering questions, listening to stories, bearing witness to pain that couldn't be adequately addressed by any legal proceeding, but that desperately needed to be acknowledged. The veterans talked about the shame of being criminalized, the fear of going to jail for poverty, the bewilderment of being told they needed help, and then being exploited instead. They talked about the specific moments when they'd tried to assert their rights and been shut down, when they'd asked for lawyers and been told they didn't need them, when they'd questioned the fees and been threatened with program termination. And through it all, Marisol listened with the full attention she should have brought to their cases years earlier. She validated their experiences, confirmed that the transcripts documented everything they described, and promised that their stories would inform not just this prosecution, but broader reforms to ensure specialty courts actually served the people they claimed to help rather than victimizing them. As the meeting was concluding, Patricia approached Marisol directly, her eyes red from crying but her posture carrying new strength. I want to testify. When this goes to trial, I want to stand up in court and tell everyone what Judge Keene did to me. Can I do that? The prosecutors will definitely want to speak with you, Marisol assured her. Your case is one of the clearest examples of exploitation. The documentation is extensive and damning. Whether you testify at trial depends on several factors, but your voice will absolutely be part of this process. Patricia nodded slowly, then surprised Marisol by pulling her into a brief, fierce hug. Thank you for finally speaking up. I know it was late. I know it didn't help me when I needed it, but it stopped Keene from destroying anyone else. That matters. The words settled into Marisol's chest like both absolution and continued burden. Forgiveness offered alongside acknowledgement that the forgiveness couldn't erase what had been lost during the years of silence. Over the following weeks, the case built momentum with inexorable weight. Keene and Rourke's attorneys attempted various legal maneuvers, motions to dismiss, claims of selective prosecution, arguments about judicial immunity, but each attempt collapsed under the sheer volume of evidence and the clarity of the constitutional violations. The journal entries were particularly devastating, showing not just bias, but active contempt for the defendants Keene was supposed to be helping. Financial records demonstrated the systematic exploitation, and the transcripts, Marisol's 16 years of meticulous documentation, proved that the abuses weren't isolated incidents, but rather the standard operating procedure of Veterans Court. 6 weeks after the initial arrests, both defendants accepted plea agreements. Keene pled guilty to conspiracy to deprive civil rights, wire fraud, and embezzlement. Rourke pled guilty to conspiracy and making false statements. In exchange for their cooperation in identifying other potential victims and providing full financial accounting, they received sentencing recommendations that still included significant prison time but avoided the maximum penalties they'd faced if convicted at trial. The plea hearing took place in the same federal courthouse where Darius worked, though in a different courtroom than where he'd first appeared in chains. Marisol attended, sitting in the gallery alongside Agent Chen, Officer Stevens, and several of the veterans who'd been victimized by the system. The contrast to Veterans Court was stark. Both defendants had high-priced attorneys, both were treated with procedural respect, both were afforded every constitutional protection that they'd denied to countless others. The federal magistrate judge who accepted the pleas was a woman in her 60s named Marissa Chandler, known for her fairness and her intolerance for misconduct by public officials. She questioned both defendants extensively about their understanding of the charges, the voluntariness of their pleas, and the factual basis for their guilt. Both men answered in quiet, strained voices, their earlier arrogance completely absent. When it came time for the government to present the factual basis for the pleas, Assistant U.S. Attorney Thomas Chen, no relation to Agent Chen, stood and delivered a summary that was both legally precise and morally damning. He described the systematic denial of constitutional rights, the financial exploitation, the targeting of vulnerable veterans, the manipulation of case assignments and charging decisions. He cited specific examples from the transcripts, reading passages in Keen's own words that demonstrated his contempt for defendants and his belief that they didn't deserve basic legal protections. And he referenced Darius's experience directly, noting that when confronted with a defendant who actually understood his rights and insisted on them, Keen had responded by escalating the abuse, adding charges, denying bail, and threatening years of imprisonment, all because he couldn't tolerate anyone challenging his authority. Judge Chandler listened with an expression that grew progressively harder. When the presentation concluded, she turned to Keen directly. "Mr. Keen, you were a judge for 11 years. You took an oath to uphold the Constitution and administer justice fairly. Instead, you created a system designed to exploit and abuse the very people you were supposed to help. Veterans who'd served their country, who came to your courtroom seeking assistance, were denied their rights, coerced into agreements they didn't understand, and extracted for fees that enriched you personally. Do you understand the magnitude of your betrayal?" Keen's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor." "I'm not sure you do," Chandler continued, her voice cold. "Because if you truly understood, I don't think you could have perpetrated this abuse for as long as you did. I don't think you could have looked at disabled veterans, homeless veterans, veterans struggling with trauma and addiction, and seen them as sources of revenue rather than human beings deserving of dignity and justice." She turned to Rourke. "And you, Mr. Rourke, you were a prosecutor sworn to seek justice, not merely convictions. You participated in this system knowing it violated constitutional rights. You inflated charges, made false statements about evidence, and coordinated with Judge Keen to punish defendants who dared to assert their rights. You turned the prosecution function into a tool of oppression rather than a guardian of justice." Both men stood silently, their expensive attorneys beside them, facing a judge who understood exactly what they'd done and was making certain that understanding was part of the official record. Chandler accepted the plea agreements but made clear that sentencing would reflect the full scope of their crimes. "This court will not minimize or excuse what you've done in the name of efficiency or institutional comedy. You will face consequences commensurate with the harm you inflicted. And when you're sentenced, you will have the opportunity to hear directly from your victims about the damage you caused to their lives." Sentencing was scheduled for 3 months later, providing time for victim impact statements to be prepared and for pre-sentencing investigations to be completed. As the hearing concluded and the defendants were led away, Marisol found herself feeling not triumph, but a kind of exhausted relief. Accountability was happening. The system was working, slowly and imperfectly, but working nonetheless. Outside the courthouse, Darius was waiting on the steps, having watched the proceedings from the back of the courtroom. He approached Marisol with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not over yet," he said, "but it's progress. Real, measurable progress toward justice." "How are you doing?" Marisol asked. "Really?" Darius considered the question with the care he seemed to bring to everything. "I'm processing. The department has me on limited duty while I complete mandatory counseling. Turns out, experiencing judicial abuse, even when you know it's coming for investigative purposes, still constitutes trauma that requires professional support. Who knew?" The attempt at humor was gentle, self-aware, touched with genuine acknowledgement of his own vulnerability. "I'm glad you're getting support," Marisol said. "And I hope you know that what you did, going through that experience deliberately to expose the truth, that took courage beyond what most people could manage." "What you did took courage too," Darius replied. "Making that phone call when you could have stayed silent, cooperating with the investigation knowing it would make you a target, helping victims find their voices when you could have maintained comfortable distance. Don't minimize your role in this." They stood together on the courthouse steps as media crews packed up their equipment and other court employees filtered past, some offering supportive nods, while others maintained careful neutrality. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plaza, and for the first time in weeks, Marisol felt like she could breathe without the weight of accumulated guilt crushing her chest. 3 months later, the sentencing hearing drew a capacity crowd to Judge Chandler's courtroom. The gallery was filled with veterans who'd been victimized by the system, federal officials who'd worked the investigation, media representatives covering what had become a national story about specialty court reform, and courthouse employees who'd witnessed the abuses and now came to see accountability delivered. Keene and Rourke sat at their respective defense tables, looking diminished, as if the months since their arrest had physically shrunk them. Their attorneys had submitted lengthy sentencing memoranda, arguing for leniency based on their prior public service, their families' suffering, their remorse and cooperation. The government had submitted its own memorandum recommending substantial prison time that would send a clear message about consequences for officials who abused their authority. But before Judge Chandler would impose sentences, she invited victims to speak. One by one, veterans approached the podium to deliver impact statements that stripped away legal abstractions and restored human faces to the harm that had been inflicted. Patricia spoke about losing her housing and her dignity while being told the program was helping her. The young veteran who'd spent 18 months in supervision spoke about the jobs he'd lost and the relationships that had crumbled under the weight of constant court reporting requirements. An elderly man with Purple Hearts spoke about being treated like a criminal at 73 years old for asking questions at a Memorial Day ceremony. A woman with 3 children spoke about the terror of being threatened with jail time when she couldn't afford the program fees while trying to feed her family. Their statements were powerful, devastating, impossible to dismiss or minimize. And through each one, Marisol felt a complex mixture of grief for what they'd endured and gratitude that they were finally being heard, finally being validated, finally being treated as human beings whose suffering mattered. When the victim statements concluded, Judge Chandler turned to Keene and Rourke, offering them the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. Both men stood, both spoke about remorse and accepting responsibility. Both claimed they'd never intended to cause harm. But their words felt hollow in the wake of the testimonies that had preceded them. Empty rhetoric that couldn't bridge the gap between their professed intentions and their documented actions. Chandler listened without visible reaction, then delivered sentences that reflected both the severity of the crimes and the need to deter future abuses by officials in positions of trust. Keene received 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Rourke received 8 years, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Both were ordered to pay restitution totaling over $600,000 to be distributed among verified victims. Both were permanently barred from holding any public office or position of public trust. As the bailiffs led them away to begin their sentences, Marisol watched their faces: shock, disbelief, anger, fear, all the emotions she'd seen on defendants' faces in Veterans Court over 16 years. The difference was that these defendants had received due process, legal representation, fair hearings, and sentences imposed after careful consideration of evidence and impact. They'd experienced justice, even if they didn't appreciate it, even if they felt it was excessive. The veterans who'd given impact statements filed out of the courtroom with expressions ranging from satisfied to emotionally overwhelmed to simply exhausted. Marisol found herself surrounded by people wanting to thank her, to share their relief that accountability had been delivered, to express hope that maybe, finally, the system could be trusted to do right by those it claimed to serve. Darius appeared at her elbow as the crowd thinned, his presence calm and grounding amid the emotional intensity. The case review team has identified about 300 defendants whose cases are being vacated or modified based on constitutional violations. Another 200 are receiving fee refunds and program requirement adjustments. It's not perfect remediation, but it's substantive. And the reforms? Marisol asked. The changes to prevent this from happening elsewhere? The Department of Justice is issuing new guidelines for specialty courts nationwide. Mandatory legal representation for all defendants. Strict prohibitions on fees that create financial barriers. Regular federal audits of program operations. And importantly, protection for court employees who report suspected abuses. Whistleblower provisions that should make it safer for people in your position to come forward before systematic violations become entrenched. Marisol nodded slowly, absorbing the information. So maybe the next person won't have to wait 16 years before finding the courage to speak up. Maybe, Darius agreed. But don't underestimate what you accomplished. You created the documentation that made this prosecution possible. You validated victims' experiences. You helped establish legal precedent that will protect defendants across the country. That matters, Ms. Vega. It matters enormously. They walked out of the courthouse together into afternoon sunshine that felt different somehow, cleaner, carrying the promise of actual change rather than empty rhetoric. The media crews had largely dispersed, moving on to the next story, but the impact of what had happened here would resonate for years through policy reforms, through the lives of veterans who'd received remedies, through the example of accountability delivered to officials who'd believed themselves untouchable. Marisol returned to work the following week, reassigned to civil court proceedings, while the courthouse administration determined the future of Veterans Court. The state had announced plans to restructure the program entirely, implementing federal guidelines and hiring an independent monitor to ensure compliance. Some colleagues welcomed her back with genuine warmth. Others maintained careful distance, uncomfortable with her role in exposing institutional failures, or simply uncertain how to navigate the changed dynamics. Officer Stevens became an ally and friend, bonded by their shared experience of witnessing abuse and ultimately choosing accountability over complicity. They had lunch together weekly, processing their feelings about what they'd been part of and what they'd helped to change. Neither of them claimed to have fully resolved their guilt or their grief, but they found comfort in shared understanding and mutual commitment to doing better going forward. 6 months after the sentencing, Marisol received an invitation to speak at a national conference on specialty court reform. The organizers wanted her perspective as a court employee who'd witnessed systematic abuses and ultimately became a key witness in exposing them. She accepted and found herself on a panel with Darius, Agent Chen, and Dennis Hartley, speaking to an audience of judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and court administrators from across the country. Her presentation focused on the small decisions that had accumulated into systematic abuse, the procedural shortcuts that became standard practice, the denials of rights that got normalized through repetition, the cultural acceptance of treating defendants as problems to be processed rather than people deserving dignity. She spoke about the importance of documentation, about how transcripts could serve as either evidence of injustice or tools for accountability depending on how they were used. And she spoke about the courage required to challenge authority, to question systems, to prioritize individual rights over institutional efficiency. The response was overwhelming. Court employees from other jurisdictions approached her afterward with their own stories of troubling practices they'd witnessed, their own struggles with whether and how to speak up. She exchanged contact information, offered support, and connected them with federal resources for reporting potential violations. And she realized that her role had evolved from passive observer to active advocate, from someone who documented injustice to someone who worked to prevent it. Darius continued his work with the Civil Rights Division, taking on new investigations while the Veterans Court case became a teaching example used in federal prosecutor training programs. He and Marisol stayed in touch, occasional coffee meetings that blended professional discussion with personal friendship. Two people who'd been fundamentally changed by their shared experience and found value in maintaining connection. Patricia, the veteran whose story had resonated so powerfully throughout the case, completed a residential treatment program for PTSD and chronic pain management, received housing assistance through VA services, and eventually became a peer counselor helping other veterans navigate the legitimate support systems that existed alongside the broken ones. She credited the prosecution and the validation of her experience with giving her the strength to trust institutional help again, to believe that not all official programs were designed to exploit rather than assist. The young veteran who'd lost everything while in Veterans Court received assistance rebuilding his life, secured stable housing and employment, and reunited with his children. The elderly Purple Heart recipient was honored at a properly organized Memorial Day ceremony where Gold Star families and disabled veterans were given places of honor rather than being priced out or pushed aside. One by one, the victims found varying degrees of healing, None of them made completely whole, but all of them receiving acknowledgement that what they'd experienced was real, was wrong, and was being addressed. 2 years after the initial arrests, Marisol received notification that the restitution fund had been fully distributed and the case was officially closed. She read the letter sitting in her apartment, the same space she'd returned to after that first overwhelming day when federal marshals had walked into Veterans Court and everything had changed. But the person reading that letter was different now, shaped by choices made and accountability pursued, by witnessing both the worst and best of what systems could do to people. She thought about Darius standing in chains, insisting on his rights even when doing so seemed futile, maintaining his dignity even while being publicly humiliated. She thought about the veterans who'd trusted a system that betrayed them but found the courage to share their stories and seek justice. She thought about the court employees who'd finally acknowledged their complicity and committed to doing better. And she thought about her own journey from passive observer to active participant in accountability. The gavel had come down like a gunshot that Tuesday morning 2 years ago, and Judge Keene had looked at a defendant in chains without seeing the truth that would destroy his kingdom. But the truth had emerged anyway, documented in transcripts and spoken in testimonies, preserved in evidence and delivered in verdicts. The man they'd tried to break had instead broken the system that abused power behind judicial robes and official seals. And Marisol, who'd spent 16 years typing words without questioning their weight, had learned that documentation itself could be resistance, that bearing witness was a form of action, and that accountability, however late, however imperfect, was always worth pursuing. She closed the notification letter and filed it away, another document in a career now defined not by passive observation, but by active commitment to justice. Outside her window, the city continued its evening rhythm, millions of lives unfolding in parallel, systems functioning and failing, and hopefully, occasionally, being called to account when they failed too egregiously to ignore. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But it was meaningful, it was necessary, and it mattered. And that, Marisol had learned, was enough to keep moving forward.